Recording in progress, I'm told. So we are recording this. Appreciate your all support of that. Let's start at the beginning of this essay. Where else to begin? What I would like to know is, where did your pen, pencil, highlighter first hit the page? Where in the beginning, in the reading of this, did you say, whoa, 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 there might be something there? Or where did you put a question mark? Or one of my favorite symbols that I often use is just an X, which basically means it's wrong. The essay begins on page 671.
I first highlighted on the first page on the basis of relationship to knowledge, and then the ambiguity of such a relationship.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Let's start there. The fundamental stake of this essay is about subverting the subject of knowledge. Now, what does that mean? What Lacan's up to here is he thinks that for a long time, the Western tradition in particular has privileged consciousness. It was all about knowledge, about thinking in service to being. The great representative of this would be Descartes in the modern tradition. I think, therefore I am. The idea that the goal of being a human was to arrive at some sort of wholeness, here oftentimes equated with consciousness or self-consciousness. You can read this also in the book I mentioned, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. There would be this pursuit of self-consciousness, awareness, wholeness, awareness. It presumes the unity of human subjectivity, the coherence of human being. This tradition that Lacan summarizes with knowledge is precisely the tradition that this essay aims to subvert, as indicated in the title. And Lacan says this is exactly what we learned from Freud. Not the unity of the human subject, but its discontinuity. There's a big difference between the field of knowledge, which is what you're conscious of, and the field of truth, which does not point to consciousness. In this tradition, the field of truth is the field of the unconscious. Truth, according to Lacan, emerges in the field of the error, where your conscious, waking, fluid, eloquent self stumbles on a phrase, can't quite remember what the date was, hesitates. For those of you that do more somatic work, it's the point at which maybe the subject starts to kind of wring their hand or pops their knuckle, has some sort of a bodily intrusion on their waking conscious speech. In other words, it's not in the field of knowledge that the truth of who you are or who your analysand is emerges. It's in the field of ignorance. It appears in analytic experience as a kind of ignorance. It's dangerous when somebody shows up and has a fluid narrative about what they're all about. Anybody who has been on a dating app and met some fools that way, you know that person that shows up and gives you their spiel. And you're like, damn, how many times you've been given that spiel? That's too well put together. That doesn't feel like it's for me. And it sure as hell doesn't feel like it's a reflection of you. It tells me how you want me to see you. What else is the profile on Hinge but an opportunity to tell everybody else how you want them to see you? Let me fill you with knowledge regarding me. Let me help you become cognizant of me, of moi, of my ego. That is not the field of truth. The field of truth is stumbled upon in the first date by the belch that escapes mid-sentence. It's the fart that you hope they won't smell when they arrive, but that you figure you better get out while you can. That is the truth. That's really what's inside you. Well, now it's not inside you. Now the air has come out from either end, but that's what was inside you. What Lacan is here doing, so I'm glad Mark points us to this issue of knowledge, is he wants to suggest that whatever it is that psychoanalysis deals with, whatever it is that it tries to help the analysand come to terms with, it has nothing to do with knowledge and everything instead to do with truth. Knowledge on the side of consciousness, truth on the side of the unconscious. This is what we learned from Freud. Now, the next move is an important one here. It doesn't mean that you are one or the other. The human subject is this continuous mashup of the two elements, a knowing self and a truthful one. Knowledge and truth continually mashing up in strange ways. This is what the human subject looks like. Some sort of a bizarre interlocking of these elements. That's the discontinuity, here represented by the knuckled jag. It's not a smooth line, it's a break, it's a rupture, it's a fracturing that keeps coming together. The best way to think is spatially here. Freud fundamentally thought spatially. The unconscious was an other place. It was always somewhere else. So think of these two hands tectonically. Come on, Californians, think tectonically. These are plate tectonics that are happening here. Analysis simply knows how to work the ridges. It's topographic. Fundamentally, Lacanian psychoanalysis is topographic work. It's topology. The graph of desire is a map, a road map. It describes a certain topology, a landscape. And everybody right now, everybody on this call is somewhere on that landscape. Every patient that you work with is somewhere on that landscape. And what I would even dare say, they are caught in a strange feedback loop somewhere on that landscape. They keep running the same circuit. And so do you. That's what's at stake here. This landscape of discontinuity where consciousness and the unconscious meet. This was what we learned from Freud. This is what Lacan is taking from Freud at this stage in his career. It's the great insight of psychoanalysis. You are never just where you say you are. You're always somewhere else as well. And the problem with Descartes' I think, therefore I am, as Freud would show us, is that it's precisely where you don't think you're thinking that you're having all your biggest thoughts. It's when you least expect it that truth rises up and grabs you by the back of your neck. It's in the dream. It's in the slip. It's in the stammer. That's where you know someone is on the verge of truth. And that stammering, that resistance, is the ego saying, please, let's not talk about mom. Please, let's not talk about that time. The stutter and the stammer, it's in the error that you hear the ego finding an outer limit, an opening to a garden that doesn't want to be secret. This was Freud's great discovery. And according to Lacan, it was the third great revolution in the history of Western thought. If you look at the opening pages of this essay, you see the name Copernicus popping up a couple of times. What do you make of this Copernicus character? What's he got to do with it? Why Copernican leap? Copernican step, you see on page 674. And on 674, there's also Darwin mentioned. What's this about?
It's the move from the center of the galaxy being the sun versus the earth.
Yes, yes, yes. So Copernicus showed us, now you could argue that this wasn't Copernicus, somebody else did this. But the idea is that prior to Copernicus, we all thought the earth was the center of the galaxy. And what we learned through heliocentrism, right, is that the sun is the center of the galaxy. In other words, we are displaced. Our planet is displaced. This world, the galaxy, the universe doesn't revolve around our planet. Quite the opposite. We are decentered. If you need a word to write down here, it's decentered. Or if you want a really excellent word that captures this even better, eccentric. From the Greek ek, meaning out, the same origin of the word exit, exit, out, from the Greek eccentric, something outside the center. Copernicus showed us that our planet wasn't the special planet. Which brings us to Darwin. What sort of eccentric work did Darwin do?
Yes,
We are separate.
sorry, Chandler. I was going to say to remove like the present human condition or nature from being the central point
That's right.
of nature, I suppose.
That's right. That's right. What Darwin shows us is that we are subject to the same laws as every other living organism on the planet. In other words, our species is not the special species. There's not human history and then outside it, surrounding it, to be tamed by it, natural history. What else is the lesson of climate change but that? What else is the lesson of coronavirus but that? In this era, which some people call the Anthropocene, in this era, we see the complete and utter breakdown that Darwin intuited between natural history and human history. Humans do shit on this planet that impacts natural history, nature. And nature in turn does stuff for real, y'all, that impacts human experience. There's no more of this lie that we can tell ourselves that we need to head up to the mountains and just get away from things, get back in touch with nature, all this urban living. Oh my God, Los Angeles, the streets of San Francisco, woo woo. Nah, that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work anymore. This was Darwin's great insight too. There's not this world of natural history that has all the beasts that Noah gathered, and then the special cabin at the back of the ship where Noah and the white people hung out. That's not it either. What Darwin showed us is that our species is not the only species on Earth, and certainly not the central species. We are subject to the same damn laws. We burn just as well as the koala. So Copernicus shows us that our planet isn't at the center of the universe. Darwin shows us that our species isn't at the center of our planet. Which brings us to Freud, the third great revolution, and the very starting place for the essay that we're working on this summer. What did Freud show?
We are not at the center of ourselves, or the self-conscious we.
That's right. Human subjectivity is fundamentally eccentric. We are always outside ourselves. And if you think about it, there's nothing new about this. The whole idea, the expression being by oneself. What does it mean to be by yourself? It's a Socratic expression. Socrates basically came up with this shit. He loved being by himself, which was different from being alone. Alone, isolation, is the condition of possibility for loneliness. But when you're by yourself, you're never alone. To be by yourself means to be beside yourself, next to yourself, with yourself, and thus able to engage in dialogue with yourself. This is what mindfulness fundamentally is about. Finding ways to put space between you and your shit in order to have a conversation with it, in order to observe it, to get a little distance, a little perspective. Freud didn't know about this, but this is precisely what he was working on. The way that human being is eccentric is always beside itself. The problem is, the very problem of the human condition is that we are so desperate to avoid this truth, this eccentricity that is us. We're so eager and desperate to feel whole, to feel complete, to feel contained, that we fail to see what a handsome condition it is to be by oneself. And you can see this now, especially. Part of the reason why social scientists are so keen on loneliness right now is they say, because we've forgotten how to be by ourselves. And one of the reasons why we have forgotten to be by ourselves is that we always have a cell phone in our pocket. And any chance, any opportunity, any time when we are by ourselves, we reach for that phone, turn it on, and search for others. The problem, though, is that when the opportunities to cultivate self-awareness at the level of knowledge, know thyself, we're back in the field of knowledge, don't forget. Anytime those fields are plowed under, anytime we lose valuable opportunities to cultivate being by ourselves, such that when we actually find ourselves alone, we no longer know what to do. And now we experience profound loneliness. When the data connection runs out, when your phone turns out to be dead, note the last time you left your house and then realized you forgot your phone. I was at a friend's house the other night. I don't know what happened. I woke up in my bed, phoneless. I didn't know where my phone was. Oh my God, where's my phone? What am I going to do? How do I even call my friend to ask him, hey man, you got my phone? Who's got my phone? What do I even do? I was beside myself in the worst possible way. It took me an hour or two and a couple pitchers of coffee before I could put myself beside myself in the best possible way. Now, I didn't tell him, go ahead and throw that phone in the trash. I said, bring that shit over here as soon as possible. But nevertheless, it took a minute. It took a minute for me to be like, okay, this is one of those opportunities. Instead of feeling disconnected, out of touch, lonely, what have I missed? Oh my God, think about what could have happened in the past 6 hours. This was an opportunity for something else, something different. So Freud simply figures out a technique for helping people cultivate eccentricity, because that's what analysis is about. It's not teaching people how to feel whole again. It's about learning how to accept and even love, especially love, the parts of you that are partial, fragmented, incomplete. I think the important thing to note here for technique at this point is what I said about the relationship between knowledge and truth. From the perspective of knowledge, truth looks like ignorance. It's unknowing. And it's out of that cauldron of unknowing that the truth will bubble out. I want to pause for a minute and see if you all have questions. We good so far? You can always thumbs up. That helps a lot, so we know. All right, cool. Good, good, good. Now,
Just
go ahead.
when you mentioned the page number, I also think I have a different copy, but it's clearly the same text. Could you mention the paragraph to see if that might help?
I will, yeah. So 797, if you have the French, yeah. So there you see the Copernican step. Darwin is mentioned down below. You can see, if you look at 798, here I'm referencing the margin. It's tough because these pages are kind of close, but 798, I'm referring to the French. If you just look to the left, you can see truth as what is lacking in the realization of knowledge.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah. A few more lines down, truth is nothing but what knowledge can learn that it knows merely by putting its ignorance to work. And I want you to know that everything you're hearing from me is gleaned from this text. I'm not making this shit up. So if you ever need a page number, or if you ever need an example, just, yo, McCormick, can you give us an example of this? By all means. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Amy. What I'm talking through right now is in the English, in the upper right-hand corner, page 675. But if you're looking at the French margins, 798 in the French. Truth's relationship to knowledge. And let me reiterate this. In the field of knowledge, which is the field of consciousness, which is the field of the ego, which is the field of awareness, or so we speak, awareness. Truth always emerges from a field of ignorance. It looks like a kind of ignorance. The truth of who you are is not where you think you know you are. Is in kind of another wonky way to put this. It is always in what Lacan on page 675 of the English, 798 of the French, which seems to be that we probably should stick with the French since people have different editions. On page 798 of the French, it is this elsewhere. And I want to reiterate this again, this elsewhere. If you look at the, I mean, I really can't say what page y'all are on. I think most of you have the proper English translation, which I requested, but some of you have different ones, so you're just going to have to work with this. If you're on page 675 in the complete English text that I asked you to get, if you look toward the bottom, about 6 lines up, the paragraph begins, indeed, a number of creeks. Yeah, I'm glad you all are finding this, even those with different editions. Notice, it is elsewhere, last sentence. It is elsewhere that the moment of truth must sound for this field of knowledge as for others. The sound of truth is also the sound of ignorance. I also want to let you know that if you need any help with any of these statements, which are extremely axiomatic, highly truncated condensations, we can always look back and you can read a whole essay by Lacan on any one of these topics, almost certainly. Or look back in the seminars and find like 18 lectures where he's just working through all this stuff. Bear in mind, what you're reading here is the tombstone. This is the gravestone, if you will. Not that writing doesn't have a life of its own, but that buried beneath it was somebody who ideally lived a very long one with lots of different experiences. So don't just read the tombstone. Let me help you learn about the life that preceded it, if possible. So let's see, we're going forward here. Things really start to happen on page 676 of the English, 799 in the French. And this brings us from Freud to Lacan.
Sam, can I ask a question just because we're hopping forward, and this could be a sidebar for later, but
Yeah.
at the top of 674, there's just a statement when we're making that transition that I had questions about, more about his ideology, where he's like, in other words, a strain of psychoanalysis that is sustained by its allegiance to Freud cannot, under any circumstances, pass itself off as a rite of passage to some archetypal or in any sense ineffable experience. So to me, that sounds like Lacan is saying Freud, by definition, cannot be depth psychology. That's what I took from that, and I want to know how we feel about that.
Yes, that's right. Do you ever wake up in the morning and just decide that you need to listen to Appetite for Destruction? Do you ever wake up in the morning and just recall the origin of Guns N' Roses, that notorious video where Axl and the gang are stepping off the bus in some weird part of early 1980s LA? Yeah. Lacan has no patience for, quote, depth psychology. He has no patience for Jung. He has even less patience for, quote, ego psychology, particularly the American tradition. And you know he has no patience for it because, as you see in this passage, he doesn't even mention anybody by name. This is how it works with Lacan. If he mentions somebody by name, even if they're an opponent, it's because he considers them a worthy opponent. Traditions that he despises the most, figures that he despises the most, get lumped into these piles of intellectual excrement that he then summarizes with a sentence and then dismisses them. So what you can also see popping here in this particular essay. Now, we have just heard the riff against what you might call depth psychology. You also hear him also railing against ego psychology a lot in here. That was a common theme of his in the 50s. He thought the worst thing you could do for a patient was to make their ego stronger. That's the last thing you want, is a strong ego. You want one that's strong enough to keep you, I don't know, waiting in line and not flipping out. You want an ego that's strong enough to help you wake up in the morning and make it to an 8:30 a.m. seminar. You want an ego that also allows you to make it to the seminar, ideally after having brushed your teeth, had your breakfast, all this kind of stuff. You're ready for this. That's the ego's job. It's to keep your ass in line. It adheres to what Freud referred to as the reality principle. You definitely want one. This is one of the things that the psychotic lacks. Part of their struggle is that they have come unmoored from the reality principle. It's one of their great issues. The more fundamental question is, why does the psychotic lack an ego? Why does the psychotic come unmoored from the reality principle? What the psychotic fundamentally lacks is a place in the symbolic, which is how we get to Lacan here. Lacan's great intervention is to point out something of which Freud was ignorant. Not because Freud was a dummy, but because that of which Freud was ignorant had not yet been invented. And it's as simple as this. When Freud is working, there are no departments of linguistics. Freud thought that psychoanalysis belonged in the same hallway as biology, physics, harder sciences. What he's working out, what he's thinking through, the way that Freud is thinking, according to Lacan, is Freud is thinking about language. Freud is fundamentally thinking about things that would later become the topic of linguistics. But the problem is, and this was the great limitation to Freud, is that he couldn't just walk to the local university, into the local Caesarean's office and say, hello, linguist, tell me how language works. Repression is a symbolic activity. What's repressed is not the entire traumatic event. What's repressed is some part of it, a representative of that event. It's a symbol of that event. Repression is a fundamental experience reserved for animals with language. Lacan would add. So what we see on pages 676 and 677 is Lacan saying, okay, we've talked about Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, now Lacan. And what Lacan brings to the table is deep familiarity with the state of linguistics at the time of his writing. In this case, it was French structural linguistics, but he had read Saussure. A lot of his work is coming out of Saussure. A lot of the terminology he's working with is coming out of the basics of modern linguistic theory and practice. And that, for Lacan, is the great difference. If Freud had just had access to a linguist, he would have said exactly what it is Lacan is here saying. When someone asked Lacan, they said, what is the meaning of your so-called return to Freud? Lacan's answer, the meaning of the return to Freud is a return to Freud's meaning. What Lacan is basically saying is that all he is doing is retranslating Freud atop in the wake of linguistics, bringing Freudian thought up to speed to the world, to the intellectual world that now has access to language study. Now, as some of you know, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm a professor. I lecture all over, but my primary home is in a department of communication studies. It is no coincidence that psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis, has found me here. The reason why this stuff makes sense is because I'm a communication scholar. And for Lacan, the centerpiece of analysis, which we all know all too well, is speech. Now, you could say that post-Lacan, there would be a great turn towards embodiment, gestural analysis, and things like this. That's in the mix as well. But Lacan's point is you are reading the popping of the knuckles as a signifier. You're reading it linguistically. The patient's gestures, their movements, micro or otherwise, you are reading them as though they're a text. You are interpreting them, which is a fundamentally linguistic exercise. What do they mean? And that's what he's introducing here on page 676 and 677. The last full paragraph on 676, the paragraph starting with Freud. Starting with Freud, the unconscious becomes a chain of signifiers that repeats and insists somewhere. Parens, on another stage or in a different scene, as he wrote, interfering in the cuts offered it by actual discourse and the cogitation it informs. This is a great little summary of how Lacan is translating what Freud is doing with repression that gives us the field of the unconscious, and then the way that the repressed always returns. And let me just add that the repressed always returns from one place, the future. Lacan is the return of the Freudian repressed. He is only what Freud will have become in Freud's time. This is how Lacan thinks. If you want a tense to work with here, something to really chew on, think the future anterior tense, the will have become. Wo es war, soll ich werden. Where it was, I must become. The key conceptual move that Lacan makes at this point is around the will have become. I was only this in order to become that. This is the great horizon for psychoanalysis that Freud discovers. You are what you are today only in order to have been tomorrow. Because it's looking back with hindsight, retrospection, that you can realize that that thing that happened to you back in that day is precisely what made you who you are today. And if you're cool with who you are today, you wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you for that trauma, daddy, mommy, primary caregiver. It made me who I am today. I was that in order to become this. Thank you.
So by that measure, the chain of signification is also a map for existence. That's like same with language, same with existence.
Yes, it is. Because Jack and Jill, at a very young age, were exposed to, whoa. Until you know what they were exposed to at a very young age, you don't know anything about Jack and Jill. It's only at the end of the sentence, when we learn what they were exposed to, that we can look back with hindsight and understand the meaning. So here could be the sentence unfolding. Jack and Jill at a very young age were exposed to, then you've got this blank at the end. Once the blank has been answered, then you retrospectively loop back around and have some understanding of Jack and Jill. If you don't see this as the very origin of the graph of desire, you're missing the basic structural move here. Language as speech unfolds in a linear fashion across time. Word after word after word. Jack and Jill at a very young age. It's musical, baby. Melodies don't unfold all at once. They unfold one note at a time. That's how speech unfolds too. In a diachronic, horizontal fashion represented here. Meaning making, though. Meaning making does not unfold in the same temporal dynamic that speechifying does. So what I'm going to do is write this a little bit better. Time, speech, signifier to signifier. It unfolds in a linear diachronic movement. Jack and Jill at a very young age were exposed to. That's how speech works. When you see that capital S, the signifier of the lack in the other, when you see, for instance, on page 681, 805 in the French, this little graph 1, this is what I'm unfolding for you. The arrow that is moving from left to right is the arrow of speech, of language use. It's unfolding in time. Jack and Jill at a very young age. And then there's this arrow, the one that starts at the end and loops back in the opposite direction, this one. It goes back in time. That's the arrow here represented with a little diamond, or I'm sorry, a triangle at the bottom, the delta, and the split subject at the end. We're going to come to that. Don't worry, we're going to talk it all through. Right now, I just want you to see the lines, just the lines. Because this is one of Lacan's great insights into how speech and meaning work. If speech unfolds diachronically across time, meaning occurs retroactively. Meaning is retroactive. The synchronic or meaning-making part of language use moves backwards in time. So you can think of films, for instance, where you watch the whole damn movie. It's very amazing. Oh my gosh, what's going on here? You never know what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden, you get to the end of the movie, and spoiler alert, they were dead the whole time. That's the reason nobody could see them, man. He was already dead. He was a ghost, right? It's at the end of the movie, looking back at all the different vignettes, that you can finally understand all the weird things that didn't make sense to you at the time. Now you get it. It's at the end. The owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. Think about the owl here. The brilliance of the owl is not that the owl can turn its head around and look backwards. That's not what I'm talking about. Owls take flight at dusk. It's at the end of the day that Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, shows herself. She doesn't open her eyes until the end of the day. So also in the Stoic tradition, we learn that this is where wisdom begins. It's at the end of your life, at the end of your day, looking back, that you can finally understand what the hell that was all about. And you say things like, if I had only known then what I know now. Youth wasted on the young. The trick, though, in this tradition that Martin Heidegger, one of Lacan's friends at this time, actually about this time, Heidegger had written Lacan off, didn't want to talk to him anymore, and said that in fact that the great psychoanalyst could use a psychoanalyst of his own. Heidegger thought Lacan was getting kind of crazy at this point. But one of the things that Lacan learned from Heidegger, conversations, hanging out together, whatever, was that being towards death is the fundamental horizon of psychoanalysis. If you want to know what to do today, if you want to know what kind of life is worth living, don't ask your present self. Imagine yourself 40 years from now on your deathbed, looking back, and ask yourself this: is the dilemma in which you now find yourself a dilemma that you will remember as a self-defining issue 40 years from now? If you're on your deathbed looking back, are you going to remember the struggle that you're undergoing right now as a definitional struggle? If the answer is yes, you better fight like hell. If the answer is no, you better let that shit roll off your back. Being towards death says, imagine yourself on the verge of disappearance, on your deathbed, where the life you're living now, wait for it, will have been. And looking back from that moment, from that future moment, a moment in which the present you now are living will have passed. This is the point at which you can ask yourself, what did it all mean? Was it important? Did it matter? People on their deathbed, you know, they say, they're like, I wish I would have tried more foods. I wish I would have traveled more. Really common one. I wish I would have spent more time with family. I wish I would have healed this relationship. I wish I hadn't waited so long to do that. People have regrets when they're at the end of their life. The way you can avoid them is by imagining yourself at the end of your life today, right now. Some of you have parents whom you know when they die are going to have a lot of regrets, and their regrets are going to have a lot to do with you. And they're going to say shit like, I wish I would have ... something to do with you. Some of you have already had this moment with your parents. The goal is to prevent yourself from getting to that point by doing the imaginative work of being towards death today. That is all that is at stake here. This is why the goddess of wisdom is symbolized by an owl. It's at the end of the day that wisdom takes flight, that you have any sense of what has happened. And Lacan's point is, Yo, this is exactly how sentences work. It's not until the end of the sentence when you realize that Jack and Jill at a very young age were exposed to a foreign language that you realize how great they had it. Now, that's not the only thing that said Jack and Jill could have been exposed to at a very young age. And you would then find them in your office, perhaps, because they weren't just exposed to a foreign language, they were also exposed to a foreign language by pedo Uncle Leonard, who taught them not just about that foreign tongue, but how to use their own. If you are not ready to hear this kind of stuff, you're not ready to be the analyst Lacan wants you to become. You need to hear at the level of a basic sentence some of the most horrific shit that human beings undergo in their waking lives. So horrific that they can't even be awake through the experience. I'm not trying to shock you here. I'm not trying to scandalize you. I'm trying to keep it 100 with you. What we have here in this other arrow is a retroactive, retrospective field of meaning. This is how every sentence unfolds. Now, there are things to note here. I bet I could make up a sentence and you all could pretty readily guess the words appearing in that sentence before they even occur. There's also an element of anticipation. We are so versed in language use that we can almost guess what word or even what kind of word would come after, let's say, the article an. If you hear me say an, you can rest assured that it's probably going to be a word with a vowel at the start of it that comes next. So just as meaning making has this retrospective, backwards facing aspect, being in speech has a future facing aspect, an anticipatory aspect. That's the word Lacan uses here. Language use is also founded on anticipation. If meaning making occurs retrospectively, language use doesn't just unfold in time, it also is chomping at the bit of the future. As a listener and as a speaker, we're always anticipating what comes. What's the word? What comes after what comes?
Next.
Next. Everybody knows it. That's the point. Yet another way in which human experience is eccentric. You're never just here. Which is why we don't translate Dasein as being here, even though da in German means here as well. You're always there, being there. You're in the future, you're in the past, but very rarely are you ever effectively present. In fact, I would say the best way to be present is to be in the future, looking back. Time is not as linear as we think. And Lacan says, only in psychoanalysis do we see that put to the use of humanity's improvement. There was a question out there. What's up?
So at that fundamental level, can we say that regret is on the same axis of desire?
Yes.
And regret is a signifier of lack at the end of someone's life.
Yes. Yes. There's a difference between living a life of lack and feeling like you never have what you want. This wheel of desire, as we've oftentimes referred to it as, where you're constantly flitting from one object to the next. You got the new car, very exciting, wakes you up in the morning, the new shirt that you can't wait to try on. Pretty soon you got a whole closet full of new shirts that have now turned to shit. That's the great, amazing thing about desire. Its objects always pass very quickly from the field of want and splendor to the field of disgust and excrement. Once you have it, you simply cannot desire it anymore. That's not how desire works. You can't want something that you feel like you already have. Which is why at the end of a relationship, you'll hear somebody often say, you're going to miss me when I'm gone. Or you don't even know how good you have it right now. And then people get like, oh, fuck, maybe I don't know how good I have it right now. Maybe I don't, because I think I have it and now I lost my desire, all this kind of stuff. Yes, Paloma, you're right. We get into the field of desire and usually live that life out as one of regret. You die in a state of regret, which is not so different from living on the wheel of desire. What are the questions you have at this point? Yeah.
Does what you're kind of getting at right now come in him rewriting like the Saussurian thing? It's like in the circle of signified over signifier to then having the signifier be on top or like greater than?
Yes. What he's doing is inverting the classic Saussurian model. Let me show you very quickly what that would look like. So in Saussure, you have this as the model. The little withered italicized S is meaning over the big S capitalized, which is word, or signified over signifier. And Lacan interprets that as saying that Saussure is telling us that the meaning is more important than the word. And Lacan says, nah, man, that's not the truth. He says the truth is, it's the signifier over the signified that captures the truth of this. And if you see this little bar right here, this is in the Saussurian model of the sign. That is precisely the bar that Lacan reappropriates to make graph one and those horizontal lines. This is that bar. And one way to read it is Lacan saying that meaning is always slipping beneath the unfolding of signifiers. Why is it slipping and always just a little bit ahead? Because words only unfold one at a time. And as they unfold, you learn a little bit more and a little bit more until the meaning is settled. Along the way, though, the meaning changes. Jack, if you just have that, you've got, okay, well, it's probably going to be a sentence about some male. And, okay, there's going to be something else, someone else, Jill, aha. Now, Jack and Jill, well, that shifts the meaning incredibly because you know little nursery rhymes about Jack and Jill, don't you? Jack and Jill went up the hill to have a little fun, right? You know the nursery rhymes and you also know their diversions. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. No, man, Jack and Jill went up the hill to have a little fun. Jack got mad. You see what I'm saying? You've got all the narratives around Jack and Jill. But I'm not talking about narratives. Jack and Jill at a very young, you can almost guess age is coming up. Oh, okay, so whoa. Okay, something's going on with Jack and Jill. Anytime psychologists hear at a very young age, they're like, tell me more about that. We're exposed to, oh Lord, here we go. Here we go. Take me to the primal scene. Show me your trauma. Show me your trauma so I can have something to talk with my own analyst about this afternoon. At a very young age, we're exposed to. Lacan's point is that the signifiers are on top because it's their unfolding that is determining the meaning. With every new word, the meaning starts to shift or develop. So that's partly what he's getting at when he has this reversal, this inversion of the Saussurian model that you all just asked about. The great example of this comes in an essay where Lacan does something very simple. He takes two identical doors side by side and presumes, asking the audience to presume, that they are restrooms. Here it is. Now, you don't know what happens behind those doors until the signifier is placed above them. Now you know the meaning of those doors. The identical doors without the signifier don't mean anything And it is no coincidence that he chooses this example, right? Because more often than not, the signifiers that tell you the meaning of what occurs behind those doors appear above. Lacan's point is that it's the signifier that determines the meaning. In other words, that the signifier, the word as speech, is the determining element. And let me tell you, Freud was very curious what you dreamt about. What Freud didn't realize, though, even though he does say as much in several places, is that the fundamental topic of psychoanalysis is not what you dreamt last night. It's how you tell me about it. It's what you say about the dream. That is the object of inquiry. It's at the level of speech, spoken discourse, not what you dreamt about. The more important thing is how you tell the story. It's a trap, a great slippery slope in analysis to think that the object of analysis is what the analysand dreamt the night before. That is incorrect. The object of analysis is their speech about that dream, with this great addition, addressed to you. What is it about their relationship to you that makes them want to tell you about that particular dream in that particular way? Now, Freud has this in many great places. In some of his earliest work on hypnosis, he talks about the magic of words. The magic of words. He was aware that it was at the level of wordplay that the great interventions would occur. But he didn't have linguistics under his belt. And so he didn't really know what it meant for words to play. Lacan does. And that's what he's bringing to the table, is this turn towards language. Here's the thing. If the human subject is eccentric, decentered, conscious and unconscious, it's language that effects that decentering. It's because we are language-using animals that we live eccentric lives. It's language, Lacan says. Language is the difference. Language. If language is what separates us, if you will, from animals, and I'm not entirely comfortable with that, where we're headed from here is towards jouissance, enjoyment. If language is what separates us from animals, jouissance is what separates us from machines. It's our ability to use speech that makes us a very weird animal. Weird because we are never entirely present to ourselves. We're always decentered, interrupted by ourselves, ignorant of ourselves. But it's our ability to enjoy, which is also a function of language use, we'll see, that separates us from machines. And I would dare say always will. That's why machines are horrific, right? Because they do not know enjoyment. That's why they're scary, but also like the best parent. The best father, the best primary caregiver is a dead one. You don't want a police officer who enjoys arresting people. That's not what you want. The law, insofar as it is enforced, whether by a judge, jury, or executioner, as the police so often become, should be done impassively, robotically, without enjoyment. All too often, the enjoyment of the lawgiver displaces the legitimacy of the law. That's a bit far afield, but it gives us a moment to pause and check in. Let's see where you're at before we take any next steps.
Can you maybe speak a little bit more to machines don't experience jouissance with the virtual age and AI coming on up?
Yeah. Well, I should say not yeah, but no. Thank you for asking, but no.
Sure.
There's a pretty good
Okay.
book called The Freudian Machine, I believe it's called. That might be a good place to start.
I'll check it out.
Yeah. Holler at me if you can't find it, and I'll help you get the site, or at least point you to the author or something like that.
When you're discussing the signifiers, I'm feeling curious again about the nonverbal aspects you discuss, and any thoughts on what Lacan might think about our use of telehealth.
Yeah.
I don't know, or key texts to think about.
Yeah, around the use of telehealth, it's very unfortunate. But I have to say this. I asked a friend of mine, a practicing Lacanian. I'm up in San Francisco and I hang out with this guy. He's kind of on the road. He's like, yo, I'm going to embrace this. I think he's in Mexico right now, but he still sees patients. And I said, how interesting, man. You're missing so many of the nonverbal codes that usually shore up your practice. And he said, yes, but in fact, I have the key code, which is the voice. I learned, in fact, that he doesn't even use Zoom. There is no screen. He's now treating patients exclusively by phone, listening only to the greatest medium of humanity, which is the voice. It's just at the level of the voice. And he says, it's great to be a Lacanian in the world of telehealth, because the great medium that you need more than any other is the voice. But I would also add this. As a communication scholar, we know that most of what humans communicate occurs nonverbally. There are all these different nonverbal channels, from the clothes you wear, to how you sit, to how close you are to others, different types of handshakes. Man, the literature on handshakes is just ridiculous. Haptics, touch, proxemics, nearness, oculesics, the study of eye movements. The list goes on and on. Lacan would say all of these nonverbal codes are still operating linguistically. And in the analytic terminology that he would use at this point, he would say that they are all operating symptomatically. The signifier is a symptom, and symptoms at this stage in his career, he's going to say, mirror signification. The symptom is a partial representative of an underlying clinical structure or issue. And it's by tracing the symptoms that you can understand what's going on with the subject, right? Lacan says the basic logic of the symptom is linguistic. A symptom is a signal. A symptom is a signifier. So that can be anything. It can be the verbal tic that occurs in speech. It can be the eye that blinks a little bit when Uncle Leonard's name comes up. It can be a repeated playing with one's hair. Hands are really great to study what's going on with people, but Lacan would say that what you're seeing there is just another register of language use, another register of symptomatology that you can study. So what I think he would say, Amy, is that telehealth is unfortunate because it flattens and subtracts a lot of the nonverbal stuff that you usually would have access to when meeting an analysand in person in your office. It also makes analysis almost too easy. Psychoanalysis in the Lacanian tradition believes that something must always be paid. Does it have to be a pound of flesh? No, but there must be some skin in the game. So what if you only pay $5 a session? You still got to pay something. Going to an office, showing up, bracketing that time in your day is a sacrifice that for the Lacanian tradition is very important. And so when it's so easy to connect, we're reminded that some of the sacrifice goes away. And my friend said the same thing. He said, man, it's unfortunate because my job is so much easier now. I can still do my work because I have the primary medium of the voice. But things just got easy. And he says, and guess what? It just got a lot easier for my patients too, which is one of the ways that my job just got harder. It's easier to do analysis when all you have to do is click on your screen. He also says, though, he's had more breakthroughs because now somebody is in the comfort of their own home, staring at the picture of their mom who did that to them all those years ago. More at ease, more willing to open up. Different things happen. In the field of Lacanian psychoanalysis, you don't have to tell the truth. Your lies are just as indicative as your confessions. You don't have to show up at the appointment. Your absence is just as significant, sometimes even more so than your presence. The great part about this linguistic turn in analytic theory and technique that Lacan introduces is that there is no way for the analysand to escape. There is nothing insignificant. There are things without meaning. The symptom, not the symptom in seminar 23 in the 70s, it will be the symptom, something that is utterly significant, but totally without meaning. Right now, though, Lacan's deeply committed to the signifierness of symptoms, whether that's a hand gesture or a word or an utterance or the like. Got time for one more question.
Thanks.
You bet.
Who was Lacan's analyst?
Lowenstein, I think his name was. They did not get on well. Good.
I have a question. It may
Go
be
ahead.
off topic. I'm curious what specifically Lacan despised about Jung.
I don't know. But if I had to guess, and I realize I don't, but why not? I think part of what Lacan struggled with was also perhaps what Freud struggled with. No matter how rigid some of these terms seem, everything is particular to the patient. Everything is unique and specific to their own lived experience. So Freud had pretty robust theories of obsessional neurosis. But the rat man was not you. The idea was that each case would present new opportunities for retheorization. In other words, that any sort of turn towards archetypal analysis was destined to fail. At least that's how I would read it. Now, let me tell you, I only understand Lacan. That's why people hire me to do this stuff, not because I understand Jung or any of that stuff. It's like I've been reading Lacan in a Ziploc bag and lecturing from that bag for the past few years. It will be up to you all with experience in Jung, with experience in the depth tradition, with experience with archetypal analysis, to judge whether every dream in which your teeth fall out is truly, in fact, a dream of your own individual death, which, by the way, is yours and yours alone. Freud's point is that living is like dying. It's very peculiar to you. We all do it, and in that sense, it's archetypal, if you will. But yours is yours, and mine is mine. Nobody can take a bath for you today, and nobody can die for you tomorrow. And I think that is kind of the guiding element for Lacan and for Freud, but especially for Lacan. In fact, if you want to put this schematically, we sure can. There are only three things that you have to have in order to be human. First, you have to have a body. Doesn't have to look like mine, doesn't have to look like yours, doesn't have to have legs, but you have to have a scrap of flesh of some kind. You have to have a body. That's the first element, embodiment. That's where all of this starts. The second element is the one where analysis does the most conceptual work. Human bodies, unlike horse bodies, for instance, need copious amounts of care from others in order to survive. You can take a baby, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and you can put it in the corner of a room, and you can leave for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 6 minutes, 6 months, and come back. That baby will be in the exact same place. It can't go anywhere. It can't go to the fridge and get food. It's not on its feet 3 minutes after it's born. Human bodies are born prematurely. It's one of the trade-offs. In order to escape the host organism, the parasite with its enlarged skull needs to be born at least 3 months before it would have been ready, which is why the first 3 months post-birth are usually referred to as the 4th trimester. Human babies, human bodies need copious amounts of care if they're going to survive. Everybody in this call right now, everybody who I'm looking at right now, is here because you received, I'll say it, good enough care. Don't get me wrong, your primary caregivers fucked you up differently than they fucked me up. Now, I didn't know them because I'm talking about my primary caregivers. And when it's your turn, if it's your turn, dare it ever to be your turn, you'll fuck them up too, even with all your fancy techniques, especially because you have a lot of fancy techniques. That's how and why you're going to fuck them up, because you're so good at unfucking people. The origin of the word fuck is a difficult one. Nobody really knows. I think it comes from the Latin term for to hit. To fuck is to hit. The third and final element that you have to have in order to be human is you got to die. The body into which you were born, the body that was lucky enough, I guess I'll have to say that, lucky enough to receive good enough care from others, also has to perish. And with those three elements, you have the origin of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Now, I can't say how that speaks to Jung. I can't say that I've read all of that in Freud, but I can tell you that these are the three pistons, ontological pistons, we can call them. Ontos, having to do with human being. Ontological pistons of Lacanian psychoanalysis. It begins with the assumption that everybody has a body. All of those bodies were at some level and for a sustained period sustained by other people. They received care, and all of those bodies must eventually die. Embodiment, care from others, and death. I don't know what else to say about it, but I think that's about as archetypal as Lacan is going to go. And I'm happy to hear that some of you disagree, respectfully or not, because much of what Lacan is doing is a provocation. This is why he had hundreds and hundreds of people in his lecture halls. It was about disagreement. That's what he cultivated. So in order to disagree, though, we first have to understand what's meant. And that's what I'm here to help you with. Are we ready to move forward? You can already tell that I don't like taking breaks. If you need a break, you can take a break. Before a seminar of this sort, one of these epic ones, I just insert a catheter. I'm good to go, people. That's not funny, man. That's not funny. Catheters are real, man. That's not funny.
Sam, I'm out of catheters. Can we take a break?
You can take a break, but I'm not taking a break, Dan. No, we will not be taking breaks. There is too short of time. And ain't that the truth of it? The problem with the truth, if it has any problems, is that there's never enough time to say it. There's no chance we're going to get through this whole essay. But by God, we're going to try. So let's start on page 677 in the English, or 800 if you're using the French pagination. The key question that opens this essay on page 677, 800 in the French is here. One sentence, one paragraph. Once the structure of language is recognized in the unconscious, what sort of subject can we conceive of for it? Now, I don't know that we are in a position where we have recognized the structure of the unconscious as the structure of language. All I've told you so far is that repression, the basic mechanism that carves out the space known as the unconscious, is a symbolic enterprise, a linguistic enterprise. And what gets repressed are signifiers. I can elaborate on that a little bit, but I don't want us to get too lost in the technicalities. Let me be very brief. The car crash. Blood, guts. You lost half your crew, half your family. The dog is dead too. The ambulance shows up, you're barely conscious. They peel your ass out of the car. What a horrible, horrible event. You haven't thought about it in a long time. You don't think about it much at all. Every now and again, you see a picture. You feel something. Something brings it all back. What Lacan would say is that what gets repressed is not the entire primal scene, the blood, the guts, the gore, the car. It will be some representative of that experience. It will be the feel of the fabric of the shirt that you were wearing at the time. It'll be that feeling of how the fabric soaked in your own blood was matted to your skin. It'll be some part of the whole event that functions representatively, like a signifier of that event. So if we were to start charting this out, we could draw it something like this. You're traveling along in your everyday life, and all of a sudden, here's the car crash. Holy shit, what a traumatic event, what a rupture. You do learn to get on with your life. Life continues as best it can. But part of that allowance has to do with the fact that you have repressed much of that experience, even if only because you can't spend every day thinking about the losses you sustained during that accident. What gets repressed, here represented as X, is something that then sticks with you throughout the rest of this experience, known as life. If it is the feel of the fabric as it was matted to your skin, that velvet shirt, suddenly you're walking along, you see an amazing Goodwill store, the best one in town. I know where mine is in the city. I always go to this store. And you go in and you're thumbing around, moving through the fabrics, and suddenly your hand touches a velvet shirt. And what do? You recoil. I'm not saying you piss your pants and forget who you are for 30 minutes, but you have an averse response, a feeling of disgust. That is called the return of the repressed. What occurs in that moment is the X that has been traveling along with you all those years now finds a Y and is back for another chance. Now, in this moment, you have an opportunity. You can either continue browsing in search of that shirt that's going to make your day, keep your desire aflight. Or you can use this opportunity to be like, damn, that was weird. Why did I recoil in abjection when I touched that shirt? That's a moment, an opportunity for you, listen up now, to look back from the moment where you touched the shirt and had the return of the repressed. You can now retrospectively look back and say, oh shit, I know why velvet disgusts me. I know why I don't like that. This retrospective meaning making is the exact same experience that happens when a sentence occurs. Here, what I'm charting for you is repression, the creation of this dotted line known as the unconscious, and then the return of the repressed when the signifier X meets another signifier, a representative of the primal scene of your trauma. And in that moment, you get an opportunity. The way we describe the seizing of that opportunity is also linguistic. This is a chance for you to come to terms with. That's what it means. That was the talking cure, the coming to terms with, the finding of new signifiers. New signifiers here represented with the letter Z to help you better understand the primal scene that sent you on this circuit. Lacan's point is that you're now 3 signifiers removed from the very event that shores up your existence. The hole in your being just got a new name, and this is if you're lucky. So what you can see here is the way that the repressed part of this event functions as a signifier that then links up with another signifier that then gives you an opportunity to link with yet another signifier. Now,
can the chain of signifiers only be additive and move in a linear fashion, or can there be backward subtraction of signifiers?
I would say the latter is more likely. You could think about this more like alphabet soup down there. All the letters are all swirling around, and that's what can happen if you don't deal with your shit. If you do not take the retrospective meaning-making return to this event, and you instead decide to just keep browsing, notice what happens. You just continue your life. You're not going to think about it. Now you've got X and Y in the unconscious, all looping around, waiting for the next time you touch velvet. The repressed, I said, always returns from one place, the future. It's a future relative to the past event in which you suffered the trauma that in turn started the circuit of repression. Does that make sense so far? So Jared, what you would have here eventually as you go forward, because we can't all seize every opportunity to come to terms with our shit, is you have a repeat offender, if you will. That's the thing. In fact, you might even say that this repetition compulsion, right? This repetition compulsion is exactly what paves the way to your doorstep. Because to be a little technical about this, what happens when the patient to be is just going through their life repeating the same mistakes, never coming to terms with it, never seizing on that retrospective opportunity to come to terms with their shit, is a very strange phenomenon. It was one that Lacan draws on from Freud to say, what in the hell is going on there? If we are so beat up, repressed, disturbed, why would we not seize on an opportunity to heal? Why would we instead will the repetition of this horrendous event? Why make the same mistake over and over again? You see, that's the difference between a lesson and a mistake. A lesson is a mistake that we learned from. But what we know about human beings is we tend to make the same mistakes. Why is your current partner very similar to your previous partner? Why are you always dating the same men? Why are you always dating the same humans? Why? The question of repetition is the great question for the neurotic. And the answer is simple. We learn to enjoy our symptoms. Now, we don't really know what to do with this. Not yet. But as we work through this essay, what you're going to find is that in everyday life, the great prohibition that shores up society is a prohibition against enjoyment. You can pursue pleasure, but not enjoyment. Jouissance? Nah, man, you got to draw the curtains, close the door, get under the sheets, turn off the lights. Think of all the secrecy that goes into the experience of enjoyment at a genital level. There are lots of ways to experience enjoyment, not just genitally, but we know it predominantly through its genitalized form. The prohibition against jouissance invites us to look for other, more surreptitious ways to enjoy. And the neurotic fundamentally has learned to enjoy the symptomatic expressions of their own disorder. The obsessive enjoys flipping the light switch, double checking the lock. The hysteric enjoys never being treated well in a relationship. So see, we're not in the field of pleasure anymore. If you are obsessive, if you've ever treated someone who's obsessive, they'll come to you and they'll tell you how fucking uncomfortable it is to feel like they can't rest unless they've checked the locks on every fucking window. That's not a happy place to be. That's not pleasure. Lacan's point is exactly, it's jouissance, it's enjoyment, which doesn't mean pleasure. It doesn't mean it feels good, doesn't mean you like it. It means it gets you off. It causes a physical intensification. In that moment where the obsessive is double checking the locks, they feel alive. And that is the question of the obsessive. Am I dead or am I alive? Very well represented by Hamlet. To be or not to be. Am I dead or am I alive? Well, goddamn, when I'm checking these locks, I sure as hell feel something. That affective intensification that comes from the flipping of the switch. The hysteric in the fight. I don't know if this is love, but I sure feel drawn to this person right now. I sure feel riled up by them. That's not pleasure. But that riled up state, when you just feel like you're ripping your hair out and you just can't even believe this person, you're just like have to leave the house and take it, all that. That's jouissance. My point is that in a world that prohibits productive jouissance, the neurotic will find maladaptive, non-productive ways to get off nonetheless, predominantly at the level of their symptoms. So why would somebody skip the great opportunity that the return of the repressed allows and just instead continue with the alphabet soup? Because it provides them with a parallel field of enjoyment. It allows them to enjoy. And when they come to you, when they arrive at your doorstep, because I said this paves the way, straight to your office. They come to you because their usual ways of repeating start to wane in terms of the production of enjoyment. They are starting to not enjoy their symptoms. That's the great opening for analysis, when the enjoyment of one's symptoms begins to fade. That's the opening into which you are supposed to step. They step into your office, but you step into their life and that moment. And that's when the work begins. That's when analysis begins. And your job is to help them see all this. I don't just mean part of this, I mean all of this. The primal scene or the traumatic event, how it got repressed, what part of it got repressed, how that keeps coming back to you, and crucially, how you keep avoiding coming to terms with that shit in order to continue enjoying your symptom.
Sam, is this the top half of the complete graph or the very top of it? Or
it is not, but the reason it looks the same is that you're seeing the same diachronic horizontal line with a retroactive loop. So the structure of it is the same, but the terms are going to be different. The upper field of the graph of desire is a field of jouissance. That's why I say the goal of analysis is to get the patient up there and help them figure out a way to stay up there. Because that's the way that they can supplant the maladaptive jouissance of their symptoms with the jouissance that is productive at the level of their drive, not driven by the symptomatic expression of their disorder, but something that traverses that disorder and gives them an opportunity to enjoy something else. And I'll tell you, it's simple. It's as simple as the first sip of coffee in the morning. That is jouissance. And the drive is what allows you to be like, you know what? I don't know what the fuck this seminar is going to entail this morning, but damn, this coffee tastes good. And I curse because I want to capture some of this intense feeling that you have. You know the drink I'm talking about. It's that first sip, and you take a drink and you go like this. And then you kind of furrow your brows and you hold the cup out in front of you, you look at that and you're like, God damn, that's good coffee. Or you look at that and you're like, oh man, who knew honey and lavender went with coffee? What? Man, you never had coffee till you had this. It's that first drink of beer, you drink it, and then you notice you have a cup of beer in your hand and you hold it up and you just look at it and you're like, I love you. This is proof that God loves me. Proof that God loves me is that first sip of beer. And that's what this feels like. That's what jouissance in a productive sense feels like. It's the kind of satisfaction that comes from a very simple pleasure, like sunshine on your skin. That's the feeling. It's the feeling, not so much of the comfort, but the feeling of aliveness. I'm alive. Psilocybin mushrooms, jouissance. Acid, too much jouissance. You feel me? Okay. So we are on page 677, 800. I imagine there are a couple more questions out there, given that I now have 3 screens full of humans in front of me. What else is there?
I'm curious about his play on jouissance, which also means to play. So when you describe it in this manner, you know, yeah, that word is like such, it just holds so much of the spirit of the language that, you know, you can have this hyper arousal in both playing as a child, you know, as a child would play a game, or if you play tennis or something like that. And the way you describe it, you kind of, you're playing with the words and you're now taking it into that field of, you know, enjoying coffee.
Yes, yes, yes. And let's not forget that if the moi in French points to the me that is your ego, the je in French, which is not too far removed from the je in jouissance, points to another form of human subjectivity, another way of living, a way to outlive the ego. You see, that was what Deleuze and Guattari figured out, for those of you that come from different traditions. What Deleuze and Guattari fundamentally figured out is that the way anti-Oedipus experiences life is by simply outliving reality. You can just outlive your previous self. And that's the jouissance we're talking about here. And one of the ways you do that is in the field of play. So I really appreciate that analogy. I'm glad that your ears are pricked to this. We were on page 677.
Hey, Sam.
Yep.
I just have another question following up that, and maybe my little attempt to extend your drawing will make my question more clear. So I kind of have like the repetition that is visible.
Yes, got it. Yes.
So just like the way that the return of the repressed kind of continues coming up and
yes, glorious. But here's what I would go ahead, Santi.
Oh, I was just gonna. So my question is about the jouissance. That like that is where jouissance comes in, but over time it becomes lessened. I'm just wondering if you can say more about that.
Yeah, that's ideal. I would say ideally jouissance becomes less. So somebody finally, for instance, is out with a friend and their friend says, you know what, man, isn't this how your last relationship ended too? And you're like, oh, fuck, they're right. And that's when you start thinking like, wait, what's going on with me? You start thinking the truth of what you actually said. It is actually true that it's not them, it's you, right? The line that allowed you to break up was in fact a statement of truth. It's not you, it's me. And what you learn in that moment is, man, maybe it is me. Maybe for real, it's me. And that could be this loss of jouissance. It's ideal because let's face it, that's usually not what happens. There are many people in need of therapy that don't get it. And they don't get it because they don't experience that loss of jouissance, that maladaptive jouissance. They still get off on their symptoms. And some people spend their whole lives in horrible codependent relationships in which they each are enjoying their symptoms. The hysteric couples well with the obsessive. The obsessive has someone to control and the hysteric has someone to prod. They make for a terrifically codependent relationship and very rarely one that lends them to co-parent counseling, to couples counseling, to anything of that ilk, because they enjoy their symptoms too much. So I say ideally the symptoms and their enjoyment would fade. Or let's rephrase, the symptoms would remain, but they would no longer be paying off or nourishing that maladaptive side. They're no longer getting you off. You're just tired at some level. And that could be how it would bring them to you. I would just say one more thing though, Santi, about your chart there. Returning to Jared's point here about how the letters would be all jumbling up. What you would see at each iteration of this return of the repressed is some sort of like dredging something up from the bottom of the sea. It comes up and it's got all of these tendrils hanging down to all of this other shit. As time goes on, as I understand the unconscious, all of these letters start amalgamating and congealing and growing onto each other. And so the interpretive work that is psychoanalysis becomes even more difficult because now you don't just have a Y that repeats at the next level like a Y2. You would have an X, a Y, and a Y2. So all of the letters start to pop as well. And what can happen is the velvet, that feeling of velvet, that signifier, can get connected to another signifier. And so suddenly you find yourself no longer connected to the original signifier of the original event, but now velvet has become felt, has become something about a pool table. And so you get these like further removes as time goes on. You can still do the work, The work is premised on your ability to do it. But nevertheless, it makes it extremely difficult because the letters just keep compounding. So I like your numbering there, so long as we recognize that that's a different Y. It's an additional Y. Hold on, let me switch the speaker view so I can see this. Yes, yes, emphasis on the ellipses. Yes, yes. Yep, that's the idea. And so,
Thank you so much.
You bet. And I would just say that were you to try and practice some of these techniques, that would be what your case notes look like. It would be like this elaborate detective bulletin board with tacks in there and yarn and shit connecting different experiences. You have to do this work of mapping the unconscious. It's a space, someplace to be mapped. I want to emphasize, though, that this structure of language that we're talking about at the level of the unconscious is no different from how a dictionary works. Some of you I know are a little out on this, so let me just be really clear. This is how a dictionary works. If I open a dictionary and I look up the word cat, I'm not just going to have a clear definition. I'm going to see other words: furry, four-legged, asshole. And I have to look at each of those words and say, do I know what furry means? If you're new to a language, you know the frustration of this. Like if you've ever tried to have a dictionary that is in the language that you're learning. So, you know, if you're working on Twee and you get the Twee dictionary and you look up a word in Twee, you're like, damn it, it's full of more Twee words I have to look up. So you look up X and it points you to A, B, and C. Now you have to look up A, which points you to C, D, and F. B, which points you to G, H, and I. C, which point, you see what I'm saying? The idea is that language, like a dictionary, works like almost like a constellation. It's a network, even better if you prefer the digital metaphor, where you have one term that you go to look up, and it points you to other terms that in turn point you to other terms. And what you wind up is this node-like constellation of signifiers. This is what a dictionary looks like. And it is precisely this that you just saw in Santi's drawing. That's what this looks like mapped. Now, he was mapping it linearly, much as I was, like as an equation, where this leads to that, leads to that, was that. But the idea realistically is that this would not even be a two-dimensional element. This is like the Death Star's blueprint as they throw it up on the screen and it spins and shit, and you can see like the interiors of it, the contours. It's truly like a constellation. The plane that forms Orion is not formed because all the stars are perfectly equidistant from you, the viewer. What in fact is represented is not just the differential system of spacings between those stars, but also the temporal dynamic. The light that you're viewing in Orion's belt started much further and longer ago than that of the sword. A constellation is what the dictionary looks like. That is also what the unconscious looks like, because in order to understand that Y2, you have to understand the Y that preceded it. And in order to look up Y, you have to understand X2 and then X, and suddenly you're in it. So if you start getting lost when you hear the Lacanian's famous phrase of the unconscious is structured like a language, the word I want to come to your mind is simply dictionary, where you have to look up other words in order to understand the word that you wanted to look up originally. That differential system where a cat doesn't equal furry, but furry is needed in order to understand cat, is called language. That is language.
Sorry, I just had a feeling. I was going to say question, but it's more of a feeling. And when you talk about the unconscious, it just seems a little presumptuous to me to think that we can categorize or draw a map of the unconscious. as the analysts ourselves. I mean, I think interpretively, maybe it could help in some ways, but I just feel like for something that's so unconscious between both of us, I mean, we're working together to make something conscious and wait and see what comes forward through that cauldron, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So I'm getting a bit lost with the line drawing and the unconscious.
Yeah, the idea is you just keep track. You keep track of the signifiers, and the constellation will appear. That's the wager. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight. And you'll be surprised at how long analysis often takes. Even in a given session, Lacan practiced what was called a variable length session. So sometimes you showed up and talked for 5 minutes, then it kicks you out. Good enough, see you next week. Sometimes you were showing up multiple times a week. Sometimes you show up and talk for 3 hours. 3 hours is what it would take in order for him to get another star on the constellation. So these variabilities depend on the analyst, they depend on the analysand. Sometimes it takes an extremely long time. But the job, if the unconscious is truly an other place, an other scene, your job is to map it. That mapping is the coming of terms. That mapping is what allows somebody to come to terms with all the weird little stars in their life. Because think about it. When you look at the night sky, it's tempting just to see a bunch of stars. And in fact, I kind of trip. I've got this app on my phone where I go out in the night and I like hold it up to the stars and I can see all the constellations. They show me all the constellations, one of these like star apps. Man, that thing freaks me out. And when I initially got the app, it was set up so that when I held my phone up to the night sky, the constellations would not just appear in the same proportion as the stars of which they're comprised. Instead, the app would make the constellation leap out of my phone at like 3 times the size of what it actually is in the sky. And let me tell you, that shit was horrifying. I got scorpions, fucking horses and lions and stuff leaping out of the night sky at me. It was horrific. Ideally, the picture that you help the analysand draw would not be horrific. It would be one star at a time. But that picture that you draw is a picture of them. What you're fundamentally mapping is them. And they have to look at that map eventually and see themselves in it and say, oh, this is why I am the way I am. This is me. Not me in the egotistical sense, but me in the sense of this is my truth. All of the weird stars that used to just hang above me in the night sky, now they all hang together. Now it all makes sense. That's that.
Yeah, I can't help but feel like it's just like too much wanting of cohesion in the unconscious. Like what happened to the abject horror of the unconscious, or the aspects of being disorganized?
A life of abjection cannot be lived. And if horror never dissipates, well, the world, the psychic experience, the clinical experience of a horror that never dissipates is called psychosis. That is what the psychotic is up to. That's why their head is wrapped in tinfoil. Now, I'm not saying that psychoanalysis can't be used to treat psychosis. It can. And Lacan started by working with psychotic patients, institutionalized beings. Freud, right, he starts with women who are straight up neurotic and rich and white and Victorian. Lacan, he cuts his teeth in the insane asylum. He cuts his teeth with psychotics. What he learns about language is learned from people who have a very disruptive relationship to language. The psychotic has a disoriented relationship to language. And that's where Lacan is getting a lot of this. That's where he gets his start. But I would just like to say that a horror that doesn't dissipate, psychically speaking, is usually a mark of psychosis. That's part of the issue with the psychotic, is that they never stop being invaded by huge imaginary others. They're always under assault. The horrors of the stars are always upon them.
But our reality is intrinsically horrifying. and that won't ever go away.
Let me rephrase. The real is horrifying. Reality is just the opposite. Reality is the sphere in which things hang together. Coming to terms, I would say, is about introducing a new kind of reality into the existence of the subject, one that is not so horrific. I appreciate where you're coming from, but the idea here is that there are ways to come to terms with the horror that is your unconscious. And it's really not that horrific. But there are ways to come to terms with it that make it, what would be a good word for this? Able to be metabolized. You see, that's the issue. Right now, the unconscious that fuels that totally whack dream you had last night, it's the unconscious is trying to help you metabolize what it has in it. The problem with that alphabet soup is that you can't quite digest it yet. And what analysis helps you do is metabolize the alphabet soup, metabolize the unconscious in a way that is not so full of shards, nightmares, returns of the repressed, not so maladaptive in its existence. Quite the opposite, in fact. In fact, what you would want to do again is look into the night sky and say, there I am.
Hey, Sam, can I ask you something real quick that just came up when you said metabolized? I know you're not really coming from the psychoanalysis piece, but it sounds like Kleinian and like object relation stuff of these like annihilation anxieties being able to be metabolized by the child. Does that have any connection?
I have no idea.
Cool. But it's like governed by a good enough mother. And
yeah.
Like our role is that, and then in therapy is essentially being reparenting in that way.
I can't speak to that kind of like transferential relationship of reparenting and stuff like that. I can tell you what Lacan says about objects. I can tell you what he says about reparenting and countertransference and the like. But I can't speak to these other traditions, which is why I'm so happy to be here with you all. Let the signifiers of the barred other be heard. I am not the other with meaning. Okay, so let's see here. Unless there's anything else, anybody else got a burner that they just have to get out of their system right now?
Yeah, could I just see the graph again real quick, Sam?
I don't know, was this it?
Yeah, that guy. Okay. So I had a question. Is Z, the Z term, is that like the questioning that occurs when the sort of return of the repressed comes up? Like, is that the why does velvet make me proud?
I really like the way that you just put that, because one of the great opportunities in this graph's development is the point at which it starts to look like a question mark. And here I am, of course, referring to the graph as represented on page 690, 815 in the French. And you can see the question at the top. And it is a retroactive question. Chevois, what do you want? Now, I like that question a lot. I like also that the two little fish hooks at the top, they look like a question mark that ends in the circle that has the A in it. It shows that this is an inquiry. But I also like and find rather brilliant the way that Hunter just put it. The key question is not what. The key question is why. Why am I this? Why is this me? Why did that just happen? That kind of curiosity is also at the start of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Why am I me? Initially, it becomes and is directed at the analyst. Initially, the patient shows up and says, what do they want from me? Which is how you can see Lacan working through it at the top of 690 here. What do they want from me? And you might even have a patient that asks that of you. Like, I don't know. I mean, what do you want from me? What do you want to hear from me? Do you want to hear that I had a shitty childhood? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? It's always the question we put to the other. What do you want for dinner? What do you want from me? Help me be the thing that helps you meet your desire. The goal, though, is to take that curiosity about the analyst and eventually direct it back towards the patient. So that eventually the question then becomes not, what do you want? But why am I so fucking curious about that? What is it about me that makes me so desperate to know what you want? Why am I so latched onto you? What would you telling me what you want, if you could, which you cannot, do for me? Why do I need to know so badly? So that question, the way that Hunter puts it, the question of why is a really important one here. Much different from the question of what. And this really is fundamental to how desire works. Everybody knows what they want. If I ask my brother what he wants for his birthday, he gets out his wallet and he has a card in there. And on that card is written all the things that he wants. And it's all written like at different registers and stuff. It's like, he looks at me, he's like, oh, this guy, he's got like 15 bucks. Okay, so what can he give me for 15 bucks? And he goes down the list and he's like, here's the object. Here's what I want. The object of desire is always shifting, because what he wants this year, he'll want something else next year. The question of why is different. Not what do I want, but why do I want it? What is the cause of my desire? And I'll just elusively say that the answer to that question of why is lack. The cause of my desire is lack. I'm missing something. Maybe even just the experience of missing is what causes desire. And the hope is that the object will plug that hole, fill that gap, complete that void. But it doesn't. And so you try a different object to complete that. But the question of why is always answered the same: because I lack. And that lack is symbolized by the S with a dash through it. That is a barred subject, a lacking subject. And that is the subject that ideally you would come to terms with, which is why I think Hunter's question is great, because it puts us on the path. Z shows that subject on the path of recognition, self-recognition. Why am I this way? Okay.
Did Lacan ever talk about his own like self-reflexivity in his theories, like his own lack, perhaps, or I think what we call shadow?
He does, but only ever elusively. I think one of the I think he could have done a lot more to allow himself, to allow people to see him less as the demagogue that he cultivated. People very much treated him as the other that was not barred, that did not lack, that had all the answers, which is why I'm never going to tire in this class of telling you I don't know. And I'm going to emphasize it every time. I don't know Jung. Have I read Jung? Yes. More than you, probably. But I don't know Jung. I don't know object theory. I don't know Klein. I don't know. Lacan didn't say that enough. And I think he would have been better served if he did. In the full graph of desire, you can see this with fantasy between a signifier of the barred other and a signifier of an other who has all the meanings. It's on page 817 in the French, 692 in the English. The fantasy that so many of his students had was that he would be the lower circle, a big other that was whole, that had all the answers, little s being answers. I think he would have been better served if he had encouraged them to see him instead as a barred other and showed them more signifiers of the fact that he did not have all the answers. He was all too ready to have them. And so to answer your question, yes, he does do that kind of self-reflexive work, but I don't think personally that he did enough, because unfortunately what his work produced were a bunch of sycophants. people who are so desperate to get it right that they don't have any room to realize how organic all of these conceptions are. Lacan's very practice of developing this theory demonstrates that he is a barred other. What he says about fantasy on page 692 of this essay is different from what he says about fantasy in other parts of this book. Coherence and consistency were not his standards here. In fact, what you have to remember, and anybody who's an astute reader of Lacan will tell you this, the reason why he does it this way, the reason why he writes in such a dense fashion, the reason why if you read his seminars, he's just all over the place, is because he's trying to perform for analysts to be the unconscious. He wants to show people just how weird and foreign this way of speaking and writing is. There's a very real sense in which to read Lacan's writing is to like have a dream, where 1 second you're here and the very next second you're totally somewhere different. You just never know what's around the corner. And he did that on purpose. A lot of people think, oh, he writes in this obscure fashion in order to prove he's smart, in order to test the disciples and all this kind of nonsense. Not in the least. He's actually trying to show you on the page what that alphabet soup known as the unconscious looks like. This is his constellation. And a careful reader of Lacan will also see that this is him having his self-reflexive moment. You can see him and his barred status in these writings. We're not there yet. For some of you, this is your first time ever even reading Lacan. But I want to let you know that after multiple readings, you can start to see him. And I would just suggest that he probably did that on purpose. Because part of what the analyst is also doing in therapy is keeping their cards extremely close to their chest. Countertransference is a necessary but bad word in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Keep your shit to yourself. Transference is great. That's where it all begins. But you, as analyst, if they tell a joke, don't laugh. When they get serious, I dare you to venture a smirk. They need to know, the analysand needs to know that you are cool, calm, and collected. If I try to keep it 100 with you here, you need to keep it 300 with them there. The analyst is someone who keeps their shit under wraps. And that's important to note here. And that's also why you got to dig pretty hard to find Lacan, Jacques-Émile Lacan, in these writings. Because what he's trying to do is write from a different place. He's trying to write the unconscious. This is alphabet soup. And it becomes more and more clear as the work goes forward. This is from the early 1960s. 10 years from now, for real, I just taught seminar 23 to some of you. In seminar 23, he just shows up with a piece of rope and starts tying knots. And for real, the lectures are studying the knots and how the ropes loop around and stuff like this, a completely topological turn away from language and towards topography. The same that I'm telling you about here with the mapping and the constellation and the yarn pinned to the wall. I'm not going to take any more questions. I'm going to drag us forward. Okay? We have just a little bit more time before we need to take a break. I'm clocked at 11:16. You have me until 12:30, and by God, you're going to get your money's worth. Page 677. The last bit that we read here, once the structure of language is recognized in the unconscious, what sort of subject can we conceive of for it? That's the question. If you know the unconscious is structured like a language in ways that we have described, what kind of a human being can we derive from that? What can we learn about human beings? And then you'll see Lacan immediately shifts to the vertical pronoun I, which is a shifter. Do you know what he means by shifter? What's a shifter? Do you see the passage I'm looking at here? I as signifier where it is nothing but the shifter. I can tell you what he means. The shifter is also the shifter that allows you to shift your car into a different gear. The same way that a vertical bar or an eye might allow you to shift into a different gear. That's part of what he means. But in linguistics, a shifter is a certain type of utterance. What is it?
It's an indexical.
Voila. Yes. Whoever uses the vertical pronoun I, they are now its referent. When you use it, as in I'm the kind of person who likes to, it refers to you. When I use it, I'm the kind of person who doesn't like to, now I'm the referent. It shifts depending on who is speaking. That is its most important part. But I want to emphasize this. In a concern for method, we can try to begin here with the strictly linguistic definition of I as signifier. Notice he's telling you we are just beginning here, where it is nothing but the shifter or indicative that qua grammatical subject of the statement designates the subject insofar as he is currently speaking. This is what I'm getting at here. To currently speak and use the vertical pronoun I is to have it designate you or indicate you, index you, if you will. But this is the important part. It only indexes you at the level of the sentence. The grammatical subject is your identity as spoken in language. There's a difference between the I referred to in I'm the kind of person who likes to watch movies, and the other being that felt compelled in that moment to tell you that I'm the kind of person that likes to watch movies. What is it about me and how I'm feeling in that moment that makes me want to represent myself to you as someone who likes to watch movies? The grammatical subject is the version of you that appears in language to others. And that's important, grammatical subject, because it appears only in the level of grammar. Examples. The selfie that you took of yourself at that dinner and then posted on Instagram. That selfie is the grammatical subject, which is not the same as the person who posted it. There's the you that is represented in that selfie. And then there's the you who on a particular morning, while feeling especially disgusting in pajama pants that you've been wearing for 6 days, decided to post that image. There are two yous. There's the you that appears put together, composed, living their best life, having an amazing dinner at the level of the selfie. In fact, if you look around at the screens right now in front of you, look at the people who are not showing their cameras, they're not turned on, but instead you can see pictures of them. Now, I don't mean to talk shit about people, that's not what I'm getting at here. My point is that everyone who has a frozen image of themselves up on display, they all look pretty awesome to me. It's quite the opposite. I think they look fucking killer. They're just like so smooth looking. Oh my gosh, hey, y'all listen, if you turn your camera off and an image of you pops up, do it. I want to see you at your best. Show me what you got. Come on now. I'll show you mine if you show me yours.
I missed that part.
Yeah, so what you want to do is, oh, damn, you all, I'm scrolling through here. Let me tell you, you all look like the therapists I wish I had. Everyone except Mimi, who has a picture of their dog, which I think is freaking awesome. But no, I'm just kidding. So I'm looking around here, we have some scenery, but most of it is like y'all looking at your best, which is great. Me at my best, absolutely. The grammatical subject is the image of you that appears when you shut your camera off on Zoom. That's the grammatical subject. It's you as you want others to see you. And it is very rarely the version of you that you find most disgusting. Your virtual self is somehow eccentric, different from, outside of your in real life self. Let me reiterate this. There's the image of you that you posted on Instagram having that meal. And then there's the you who on a particular morning, wearing some nasty ass pajama pants, felt the urge, the impulse to post that image. What Lacan is here saying is that the same thing occurs when you use the pronoun I. There is a splitting that happens, a splitting of the subject, that is represented like this, a splitting of the subject into two different fields. There's the field that is grammatical, the field of the grammatical subject, the GS, you as you appear in language. And then there is another one, the one that we're about to talk about, which is that of the enunciating subject. There's you as you are spoken in language, and then there is you as the speaker of those words, and they are different. They are fundamentally divergent beings. But here's the hook. The hook is that they are also both you. And whatever it is that you are the relationship. You are the set that contains those two elements. You're both. I'm both. We each are. So it's tempting to say, well, the grammatical subject, the selfie on Instagram, that's not real. That's not me. That's fake. But here I am on the other side. This is the real me. And you do shit like that too, right? You'll post a picture on Instagram and you'll tag it, no filter. Feel me? Right? That's called the realist style. When you go out of your way to pretend like you have not gone out of your way to appear a certain way. It's like spending $400 on a pair of jeans that are about to disintegrate because they're so worn out. It's like spending $80 in San Francisco, which is about how much it costs, to get a haircut that makes it look like you just rolled out of bed. It's about spending even more than that, ladies, hundreds of dollars on makeup that makes it look like you're not wearing any makeup. You go out of your way to make it seem like you're not pretending. The elaborate artifact of keeping it real.
Is the grammatical subject you because it's the you that you want others to see, or is it beyond that? Is it just it's you because it's the part of you that wants others to see you in this way?
The grammatical subject, yeah, great question, is this. It's the ego. It's the moi. It's the me, 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 me. That's what we're working at. It's the me, me, me. M for moi, which means me, which points to the ego. And I say points to the ego because the grammatical subject is a little more complicated than that. If you were to trace it through the completed graph, it would be the split subject at the bottom right. If you turn to page 684, you can look at graph 2 and even see this thing unfolding. You don't even need the complete graph. The split subject down at the bottom right, that's you in the pajama pants, feeling all funked up. And then there is this ideal ego just above it. That's the version of you that you think is the best. I likened it earlier to the poster that hung above your bed when you were a teenager. It's the celebrity that you think you might actually look like because somebody told you once that you look like that celebrity. It's this better than you version of you that you aspire towards. The ego is that left turn from the ideal ego to the M. It's a composite version of you. So what you're posting online when you post a selfie, it's not just an image of you at your best. It's an image of you at someone else's best. It's an image of you that you think might remind other people of better than yous. So what goes into the production and selection of a selfie is not just, is this my best self, but how close does this self approximate selves that I believe are better than me even? You don't just post any selfie, you post the one that makes you look most like the celebrity that somebody once identified you with. That's the ideal ego, this celebrity that props up your ego. You can see this very clearly anytime you do the one thing that I'm sure everybody in this room has done. Everybody on this call has done one thing, I guarantee it. It is not use the bathroom. Some of you have not gone to the bathroom yet today. It's not eat. Some of you haven't eaten yet. Maybe wake up. Wake up's a kind of a good one. Nah, I bet everybody on this call has looked at themselves in the mirror at least once, even if only at a glance. That version of you that appears in the mirror is what gives you your ideal ego, your specular image. The speculum is the mirror, right? This gets back into some old Lacan stuff. You can look up the mirror stage and read about it on your own. It's usually the thing that everybody who wants to talk about Lacan has read. You can ask them, ask your instructors. They're like, oh yeah, the mirror stage. Yeah, the mirror stage. Yeah. Baby in front of the mirror, got it. Which is great. I'm glad that they're reading any Lacan. The point here though is that when you post something online, that grammatical self, it's not just your ego. Because in the Lacanian tradition, the ego is a composite. It's a collection of things that have been cobbled together to give you a sense of self. Your sense of me is not strictly comprised of materials of your own choosing, certainly not of your own making. Your sense of self is comprised of all this other shit that the world has lowered into your life. Norms, expectations, and so forth. The ego is a composite structure, is what I want to get at, but that is also included in the grammatical subject.
Sam, could I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
With the grammatical subject, I know Lacan's got more than, small interest in cybernetics. The grammatical subject, is that a positive selection? Like, I want you to see me as this sort of person, or is it a negative selection? Like, I don't want you to see me as that sort of person?
Both.
Both.
But because this thing operates in the field of language, every positive indication is also a negative indication. The same way that, remember the cat definition. In order to understand the meaning of cat, there's the positive term I'm looking for. I have to understand all this other shit that cat is not. Cat does not equal fur, but fur is associated with cat. It's connected in a differential way. So anytime you're posting something online, let's say with our example, you are asking people, yes, to recognize you affirmatively in a certain way, but you're also asking them to recognize you that way in the context of other possible recognitions. So let me give you another example, an example we've already heard. When you post an image online, even some of you who have your screens up now, your placeholder images, you can see people that are looking quite natural. You post an image of yourself like kind of in the moment with the $300 makeup that makes it look like you're not wearing makeup, the $400 jeans that look like they're about to disintegrate because they're so worn out, the $80 haircut that makes it look like you just woke up out of bed and you're having a natural moment. You're just smiling big. You're just having a natural moment. What you're inviting there, the kind of recognition that you seek from others, is you don't just want them to see you as the kind of person that keeps it real. You are asking the world to see you as the kind of person that keeps it real, distinct from all those fucking posers out there who try to make it look like they're all staged. Like, the idea here, in other words, is that the recognition you seek is a differential recognition relative to other people whom you do not wish to be identified with. That's why you hashtag no filter. Because what you're basically calling out is all the fools that take pictures of themselves and then apply elaborate filters to make themselves look better. And what you're trying to say is, I'm not them. So it's both, Chandler. It's a positive, affirmative identification of you, but it is also deriving meaning from its differential relationship to what you're not. I'm not the kind of person that use filters. You see, for instance, even with, if we march it back to the I'm the kind of person who likes to watch movies. What you're basically saying there is I'm not the kind of person who likes to read books. Think about it. I'm the kind of person who likes to watch movies suggests that you're a little looser. You're just a little looser than all those stuck-up book nerds. Because think about it. Books are private. No one has ever read a book with another person. Yeah, you can read a book out loud, like you did in elementary school with your class. But the fundamental modern experience of reading, the experience of fiction, is a private experience. Most reading is done by yourself. We read alone. We read privately. Movies, though, cinema, the development and advancement of cinema was always fundamentally a collective experience. Movies were meant to be watched with others. So when you tell somebody, I'm the kind of person who likes to watch movies, and I just chose this example at random, I'm just working with it. What you're basically telling them is, I have room in my life for you. I can do things with you. I like to relax with others, and maybe you could be one of them. But if you're like, oh, I just like to read books. I really like to have time to myself. I'm really not a people person. You feel me? Like, you're not saying that. You're saying, I like to do something that in the collective unconscious, if you will, in the collective unconscious, signifies that you're somebody out and about, somebody on the scene, somebody who goes to see movies with others in public, perhaps even strangers. So on the one hand, you're saying positively, please see me as somebody who is a film buff. But what you're also saying is, I'm not the kind of person that's just going to read a book in silence by myself. You feel me? Notice your choice of the word movie too. You didn't say film. And you know, as soon as somebody shows up and uses the word film, that they're going to try and put some boring ass black and white shit in front of you and expect you to watch it and enjoy. Film. I enjoy films. Like, great. It's in a language nobody speaks anymore, and it's in black and white. And you're going to tell me it's a masterpiece, a work of art. And I'm just going to be here and be like, this ain't a movie, man. This shit is boring. This shit is boring. I want to watch Fast and Furious 13. Right? A movie also suggests that you're kind of easygoing. So even within, I'm trying to get it, even within the genre of movie watchers or cinematic experiencers, you're trying to carve out a special place for you. I'm not a film buff. I just enjoy watching TV. You notice you didn't say TV either, because TV would be even more vapid. I like to watch 8 episodes of Alone before bed every night. You're not saying that. You like to watch movies. And those of you that know, that time of the night, maybe tonight will be one of them, you go to Netflix, you turn that shit on, and you're going to have a choice. Do you want to watch a film or a movie or just a show? And you might ask your partner, be like, what do you want to do tonight? What do you feel like? Let's just watch an episode. Yeah, I'm tired too. Let's just watch an episode of something instead of a movie. In these moments, though, you're doing the work of positively identifying yourself as a certain type of critter, but also in a differential relationship to other types of critters. So the same logic of the dictionary holds here. The same logic of the unconscious being structured like a language holds here. Everybody good? Okay. The next figure I want to focus on here is that of the enunciating subject. So we were just on page 677, 800 in the French, reading down. We read the paragraph that begins, in a concern for method. And what it says there is that the vertical pronoun I is nothing but a shifter. It's indicative that as a grammatical subject of the statement, which we just discussed, designates the subject insofar as he is currently speaking. The key word here for us is designates. To designate is something very particular. Note the next paragraph. That is to say, it designates the enunciating subject, but does not signify him. This is obvious from the fact that there may be no signifier of the enunciating subject in the statement. An extremely important and revealing passage. The grammatical subject is the version of you that you try to display for others. It's the selfie. It's the I statement. It's the part of you, it's your best foot. You always want to put your best foot forward. It's your first impression. It's all of these ways that we talk about trying to present yourself. It's the presentational work that you see going on when people turn off their cameras on Zoom. That's the grammatical subject. What Lacan's saying, though, is that part of what is also in differential relationship to this grammatical subject is the version of you that felt the need to put forth that image. That version is called the enunciating subject, and you can see it here. It is designated by the grammatical subject, but not signified. The reason why Lacan puts it that way is because most of the work that the grammatical subject does is to keep the enunciating subject in the dark. That's the part that you don't want somebody to see. That's you in the nasty ass pajama pants that you've been wearing for 3 days. That's the part that you're not showing. So the grammatical subject designates this other, less attractive, you think, version of yourself. But it does not signify it, because part of the job of the grammatical subject is to place the enunciating subject under erasure. Think about, again, what happens when you turn off your video. What's happened right now is I have placed the version of me that was live and embodied that you could see under erasure. I've put something in front of it. Now you can't see me. You can still hear me. The enunciating subject is still here, but not as it is now. The grammatical subject is like a persona. And if you think about this in the Latin tradition, persona was a mask that actors would wear. So you see this very classically represented in the faces of tragedy and comedy. There's the smiling, crazy ass looking face or mask of comedy that gives you the deranged clown in the modern tradition. And then you have the face of tragedy, which is like, it's all upset. Those masks were originally things that actors in the Latin tradition would put on their faces so that you could tell what was up with them. A persona is that. A grammatical subject is that. It's the mask that you throw up that designates because it tells somebody that there's something behind it. If you want a really good word for this, what you're seeing right now when you look at my image, it is a veil. The veil designates a behind the veil. It brings with it something behind it, which is why you can hear the patient stumble and stammer symptomatically and guess, what's that connected to clinically? What's the clinical structure that causes them to stammer every time they try to talk about their daddy? You see, the symptom here would be the persona, not unlike the grammatical subject. And your job is to plumb its depths, to figure out the enunciating subject behind the image, veiled in the image, designated but not signified by this image. It's careful work that Lacan is doing here. In fact, he says, this enunciating subject, he says the only way that we can really capture this in French is with the French ne. You see this right here on page 677. The enunciating subject, he captures it with the French signifier ne. Now, I can just tell you, there's no English equivalent to this. I can't figure it out. But the closest I can come And thanks here go to Bruce Fink. The closest I can come is an expression that would go something like this. I couldn't help but notice. Lacan's trying to get at here. There's a version of us, the enunciating subject, you in the nasty pajama pants. Remember, this is all going to point to the unconscious. If the ego, conscious version of yourself is the grammatical subject, the enunciating subject placed under erasure by the proliferation of this image is going to be the unconscious. It's going to be not the moi, but the je, not the me, but the I, not the self, but the subject, not the conscious ego, but the unconscious structure. So you see how these things, these pistons are working here. In the case of this nay, the best opportunity we have for it is, I couldn't help but. I can't stop myself from. I can't resist. I couldn't resist. That's a great one for this. The nay he's getting at here is that in these statements, I couldn't help myself. It shows that you are split. It shows that there are two of you. There's the version of you that did what it just did. And then there's the version that tried to keep you from doing it, but failed. I could not help but call you a shitbird. I couldn't help but notice, right? I couldn't help but notice that you take this bus every single day. Basically, what you're telling them is like, listen, I'm sorry if this invades your privacy, but I couldn't help but notice, da 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 da. There are two of you going here. That's what he's getting at with the French nay here. The enunciating subject can only be represented when the self doubles back. There's a version of you that spoke and one that tried not to. A version of you that tried to speak and a version of you that held back. It is precisely here in this back and forth that you get a sense of this other scene, this behind the scene, behind the veil.
I feel like we're not quite there yet, but I'm just wondering, like, does the enunciating self ever get to pose chevois to itself from itself, absent the lens of the other? You know, like, is there ever a pure, and if so, how? But maybe that's later.
Eventually, that's what you would like to be able to do. So the end of analysis is not the end of self-analysis. The kind of mindfulness and self-compassion that Lacanian psychoanalysis culminates in, the type of jouissance that psychoanalysis culminates in, is one that produces for you ever recurring opportunities to ask yourself, chevois. Notice you're not saying, what do I want? The question is still chevois. What do you want? It just happens to be addressed to you now. What do you want? And you think this is only the question of the psychotic. The difference, though, is that the psychotic thinks they're talking to somebody else. That's the nature of the delusion. The psychotic produces in their own voice the voice of another and asks it, what do you want? From our vantage point, it's all originating from the same speaking subject. The psychotic doesn't think that, though. That's the nature of the hallucination, is they actually think it is another being there with them, in them. Hence, again, the tinfoil. In order to keep themselves from being invaded by these exorbitant others, God, Colonel Sanders, the Queen of England, in order to keep these beings out, the NSA, Mark Zuckerkorn, face crack, all the stuff that tries to get in, they're listening, man. I got to put a piece of, I keep a piece of tape over the camera on my laptop because the NSA is watching me. That paranoid delusion, it's a good reminder that the basic structure of the ego is a paranoid one. Narcissists are the most paranoid people you know. They can't imagine a world where somebody wouldn't want to watch them through their laptop screen, which is, of course, a defense mechanism against the great truth that every narcissist knows. Nobody cares about you. You're not worth observing. You're not important. No one's watching. No one is paying any attention to you. That's the truth that the narcissist can't bear. And the defense is the Scotch tape or whatever over them. I guess it wouldn't be Scotch, right? It would be like masking tape over the camera. So you have at the level of hyper-driven egos, the very same paranoid structure that you see in psychotics on a regular basis, except it's not so overdriven because the ego still has a really strong connection to reality. They're not wrapping their heads in tinfoil. They're not living on the street. They're not wrapping their feet in like trash bags and all the kind of shit that you usually see when you live in a big city. The psychotic doesn't show up that way, but the paranoid structure of the ego does come through here. The question, go ahead again. Yeah.
I was going to say something. Does that, it makes me think that that's part of what you said earlier about this sort of more, I wouldn't say epitome, but part of the pinnacle of being by oneself, being with oneself, is having the grammatical and the enunciating self speaking to each other directly as part of that.
Bingo. You actually in that moment would allow the enunciating subject a chance to speak. That would be ideal. And that's why, again, I want to emphasize the question, che vois? What do you want? Another way to ask it, think about this, the enunciating subject asking the grammatical subject. The version of you in sweatpants asking the version of you on Instagram right now. What do you want from me? Why won't you leave me alone? Think about this too. When we take a break, some of you are going to go check your mail, not just your email, although the same logic applies. You're going to go check your mailbox and you're going to get a letter in the mail. And without even opening that letter, you are going to know who it's from, what sent you that letter, and you're going to know, fuck, there's a bill in there, or there's this in there, there's that in there. And you're going to look at that letter and you're going to say, what do you want from me? Why are you sending me this, Google Fiber? I'll never use you. Why? Why would you do that? Here's the thing though. What you are asking that question to is not just the address printed in the upper left-hand corner. You're also asking it of the name to whom the letter is addressed. That is also the grammatical subject. The grammatical subject is that version of you that is attached to a bank account somewhere right now. It's the version of you that is circulating in print. It's the version of you that reputation.com is trying to clean up right now. There are versions of you that are in circulation in capitalist economies that are not the version of you that is showing up right here. If you want to know where this version of you appears, it is in the letters that form the names in the lower left-hand corners of everybody's screen right now. That is also the grammatical subject. So you can see if you just look at the screen in front of you, I'm looking at mine, I see a version of myself, which I love tremendously. And then in the lower corner here, I see it says Samuel McCormick. This is also the grammatical subject. Even without putting up my selfie, I can still see the two versions of me. There's the version of me here in the screen, and then there's the version of me down here. Lacan says that listening to a patient's speech is like listening to a musical score. You have to be able to hear all the different registers of sound. You have to hear the grammatical subject speaking, and you have to hear the enunciating subject muffled beneath, or those moments where the enunciating subject spikes up, interrupting the flow of the grammatical subject. But the idea is that you would have these different levels, the same way you see on the very screen in front of you, the screen that allows you to be here today. There's me, and then there's Samuel McCormick, whatever the hell that is. And my question sometimes to Samuel McCormick is, what do you want? And Samuel McCormick's question to me is often, what do you want? I said earlier too, that when you put these two things together, you have the split subject. This is how we get the split subject. Split by the fact that you exist at once in your body, embodied, that's your enunciating subject, in a field of affect and feeling, but also in a disembodied state. That is the field of language, of the grammatical subject. Lacan's point is that the bar that divides you into these two beings is linguistic. It's because we have access to symbols that we can symbolize ourselves primarily, that we in turn split ourselves into two beings. One that appears in and as the symbol. This is your name in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And then there's the version of you that's showing up behind it. Now, technically speaking, we would say that these are both grammatical subjects, because I'm not here naked. You can't smell me. You don't know that I'm lactating right now. I got all that tucked away. You see? So we're all dealing with the grammatical subject, but for purposes of illustration, you can see the difference between your printed name in the lower left-hand corner of the screen and the image of you that shows up looking like you look, all fucked up and nasty.
Is this what he's getting at on 678? He talks about the most significant being the cut.
Yep, that's it. At the top of page 678, just to the right of 801, you can see the transparency of the classical subject divides. The classical subject is the one we started with today, with this emphasis on being whole, complete, self-sufficient. If you think about the role of autonomity, of autonomos, self-legislating and Aristotle forward, the idea of the individual, the idea of the self would be somebody who could be self-sufficient, who doesn't need others, who is whole and complete to themselves. This is an autonomous subject. Auto meaning self, and nomi from the Greek nomos meaning law. You would make your own laws. Autonomy. And what Lacan is here saying is there ain't no such thing. You are never sufficient to yourself. In fact, the truth of the matter is that the classical subject is always divided, undergoing as it does the effects of fading that specify the Freudian subject due to its occultation by an ever purer signifier. All he's talking about there is language. The way that being a language-using animal also results in a splintering of us. Your dog is not divided in this way. The lizard on the rock is not divided in this way. They are not split subjects. We are. And it doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter what kind of symbol system you have. If all you have is sign language, you are still mediated by the signifier and thus splintered into a version of you that can appear in language because you can talk about yourself and people can mail you letters and they can talk about you. And then a version of you that sometimes feels like you need to be talked about. A version of you that feels like sometimes you need to be the center of attention. There's a multiplicity of selves, which is why Freud begins his book on group psychology with the now totally truistic statement that doing individual psychology is always already doing social psychology. Nobody is self-sufficient. And that's the great point about language here. Autonomy doesn't exist because the very medium of human experience, language, is not of your own making. In order to be even neurotic, forget about normal, whatever that means. Normal just means average. But in order to be a human subject in this sense, you have to allow yourself to be mediated by language. And that language is alien initially to you. Still is. You didn't make it up. That language was given to you. You were forced to adapt it, forced to appropriate it, forced to absorb it. Your dog didn't. The lizard on the rock never will. It's part of our thing, which is why humans are always so fascinated. Are dolphins really communicating? What's up with dolphins? Let's talk about all the animals. What about these elaborate bird dances? We get into all this effort to try and find symbolicity in the natural world. And you can go pretty far in that direction, but not nearly as far as we have taken it. An animal can cover its own tracks and make it seem like it's gone somewhere that it hasn't. But it can't cover its own covering of its own tracks in order to do the double deception that we can with language. So yes, to answer the question, top of 678, that division that the subject undergoes is an effective language. And that's exactly where I want to turn next. I want to suggest blasting a little bit forward into some mathematical theory that you're probably not going to like. That this split subject that I've been drawing here, you can see the big S, and then you can see the grammatical subject, and the enunciating subject, this version, this tripartite self that we're working with here. 3, because you don't just have the grammatical subject and the enunciating subject, you have also the bar that divides them, the minimum amount of distance needed to keep these two entities distinct. That is a third element, well represented in Cantorian set theory, which is something Lacan is going to get more into. But for now, we can write like this. This is a set. Human being, the self, whatever we want to call it, is the relationship between a grammatical subject that is constantly being posited, hence the 1, and an enunciating subject that is constantly being zeroed out. This is Cantorian set theory, and it's one of the most sophisticated ways of understanding what Lacan is doing here. It's tempting to think that we are this. This is the ego, this is the grammatical subject. But Lacan's point is that you actually need 2 other elements in order to make this thing cohere. There has to be the embodied speaker that is zeroed out, and then the differential relationship, here represented by the comma, that connects these 2 elements, uniting them into a single set, hence the set theoretical brackets. I'm throwing this out just to get a little loose as we approach lunch, but also so that you know that there are some very precise mathematical ways of representing what Lacan is doing. And then I also want to remind you that he thought by learning all of this, you could do better for your patients. He thought that when you learned this, when you had this under your belt, you were better equipped to help, especially the difficult cases. And let me tell you, those are the ones that went to him. We've got about 30 minutes before our first break. I'm tempted to keep going forward. Bear in mind, if you actually look at the completed graph of desire, all I've described for us so far is the split subject, a single entity in the bottom right. Now, as you'll see, I've already been taking you through about 6 or 7 of the terms, but right now, the only one that has explicitly been brought to our attention is the split subject. Let's pause for a second. What questions do you have at this point? What can I further clarify? What do you need an example of? Let me know.
Did you, oh, go for it.
Sorry about that, Hunter. Yeah, I was wondering, would you say that we are inherently fragmented beings and therefore we created language to like better fragment ourselves, I guess in an unconscious way, or has language been the cause of our fragmentation?
The latter.
Okay.
But I want to be very clear about this. And I have to just tell you, this is probably going to be the most difficult part. It's the most difficult conceptual part of this model, this approach to analysis that I know of. Language has the effect of fragmenting us. Because there is language, we are split subjects, because we're always in two worlds at once. One is sociolinguistic, represented by Instagram, the US mail system, Zoom. Remember all the examples I brought out. The other is bioanimalistic. That's the biological self, the animal self, the self that sweats, the self that is now hungry. And we are separated into these two selves by language. That's why I say the effect of language is a splitting of human subjectivity into these two elements. You're always embodied as a bioanimalistic being, but also disembodied. Here's the grammatical subject. As a symbolized being. You all have social security codes. You have that shit memorized. We could each right now trot out our social security numbers. Blah, 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 blah. That's also you. That's the grammatical you. That's the state's version of you. That is also a version of you. It's a number, but it also operates linguistically. So because there is language, there will always be at least two of you connected in a differential relationship that forms your conception of self. Okay, that's the part we've got so far. What I want to emphasize, though, is that doesn't mean you were whole before language intervened. You were not a whole coffee cup before somebody broke your shit in half. It doesn't work that way. And this is one of the squirreliest conceptual points that Lacan makes. The fact of fragmentation in lived human experience does not mean that you were once unfragmented prior to. And any belief that you were is simply nostalgia. Nostalgia is not a memory of an experience you had. It's a longing for a past that was never yours. There was no Garden of Eden until Adam and Eve were ejected, at which point the Garden of Eden becomes the source of what you've heard described here as the fundamental fantasy. Hot tubs, cedar piles into which you crawl, weighted blankets, long embraces, dreams and fantasies of being swallowed. Think about this shit, man. I just love being in the ocean. I just love swimming in it. I love just feeling totally encompassed and held by the sea. All of these, quote, uteromorphic fantasies are not longings to return to a past that is now gone. No. They are longings to accomplish a human experience that can only be experienced as lost. That is absolutely key here. It's lost not because you once had it and now it's gone. It's that in the wake of language, where all we know is fragmented subjectivity, because we are linguistic beings, we can imagine fragmentation in a differential relationship with something that's unfragmented. We can imagine heaven. We can imagine wholeness. The lizard doesn't know that it's whole, pre-fragmented, anything like that. The lizard don't know shit. The lizard doesn't know that the rock is not the lizard. It's only in the field of language where we have terms like lizard and rock that difference even can be pronounced. So you see, that's the thing. And if you run this through various relationships to food, various hunter cultures, when you actually start looking this one through, you can see the way that people are in their lived environments. To be more like the lizard is to have a very different and non-alienated relationship to the squirrel that you just destroyed with a hammer in order to eat and live. But we as human beings have these great distinctions enabled by language that allow us to dream of worlds without distinction. That dream is the fundamental fantasy, which doesn't mean that we were once whole and then we lost it. It means that wholeness can only ever be experienced as lost. And that's different. You don't have to understand it right now. You can just write that shit down. We weren't whole once and then we lost that. It's not like the Garden of Eden was where we all were and it was all great and then we fucked it up and had to be kicked out. No. The Garden of Eden is a dream perpetuated by people who have always only ever lived outside it. That's why I liken it to nostalgia, longing for a past you didn't have. Make America great again. That's nostalgia. Great for who? My mom's brown. It wasn't great for her. That ain't her dream. But the idea of a return to some sort of a, again, uteromorphic, everything is complete, Garden of Eden, they were naked and unashamed. It doesn't mean that they were that and then became this linguistically split subject. No. It's a product of linguistic splitting, fading. The dream of wholeness is a function or an effect of being divided. And let me put this very clearly. If we were all united together, one human race, there would never have been the need in the first place for a great orator to rise up and proclaim us one. E pluribus unum would not exist as a phrase if at the start we were all unum. There'd never be a need for anybody to say, I love you. We're together till death do us part, if that were an original fact of human experience. It is not. Wholeness is the fantasy that is perpetuated by a world of division. I want to be really clear about that. You didn't lose Eden, but you can experience it as a loss. Say again.
Oh, you say Lacan was Picasso's therapist?
Didn't matter. Sorry.
That's cool.
I didn't realize we were unmuted. Hold on.
Oh, that's okay.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could go back to the relationship between Heidegger and Lacan. On my first read through this, I'm obviously brand new to Lacan. It felt like he was still trying to bridge the subject-object split. And I think I'm starting to reformulate that now just in terms of like, he's being more granular. If you were to take Heidegger's tool analysis, the hammer's broken. So now we're analyzing it in a very granular way. And I also saw something Zizek writes that Lacan is not a Heideggerian, but Lacan uses like Dasein, and I was just curious about that relationship.
Yeah, that's great. And there's, again, I want to emphasize that early Lacan is very much indebted to this German philosopher named Heidegger. The extent of that debt, some of you have read my recent book, The Chattering Mind, is a big topic. It's a real topic. It's in fact something to be considered. I wouldn't say though that Zizek is wrong, and that makes Lacan a Heideggerian, but he did learn a lot from Heidegger. And the example that you're bringing up is a very good one from early Heidegger, 1920s, where he's talking about somebody, let's just say, working on the roof of their house with a hammer, and they're swinging away with the hammer to the point that they don't even realize they're using a hammer until the hammer breaks. And Heidegger's point is a phenomenological point. It's about noticing and attunement. The question Heidegger asks is a little different from the one Lacan asks. Heidegger wants to know, at what point does any entity in the world appear before me as something to be reflected upon, contemplated, considered, and the like? And his argument about tool use is that when we're just picking the thing up and using it, we're not thinking about it. But as you can see in this coffee cup, it's been cracked. There was once a time when I reached to pick up this coffee cup and the finger piece popped off and the coffee fell. And suddenly I was acutely aware of the fact that I was drinking coffee. Phenomenologically, most of the time, you pick up something, take a drink without even thinking about it. Some of you are doing it right now. Your mind is elsewhere, you're directed elsewhere. Same with pens. You pick up a pen, you start to write with it. You don't even think about how you're doing this until you try and the pen is out of ink. It's at the level of technological breakdown that entities in the world start to jump out to us as entities for thought. Lacan is not oblivious to this. In fact, I think he likes it. It's as broken, as malfunctioning, that we start to become aware of things. For Lacan, the great malfunctioning tool that brings us closer to awareness is speech. It's at the level of the stutter or the stammer, the hesitation, when the fluid articulations of the ego start to crack and rupture. And some of you that know my earlier work know that this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. Hesitations, pauses, slight intonations, interruptions of any kind in speech, all the stuff that Freud would refer to as a slip. These are the ways that the tool of language breaks down and gives us an opportunity to significantly reflect on our relationship to that tool. The same way that a hammer that was ready to hand in the Heideggerian sense, when broken, now becomes present to hand and subject to reflection. Heidegger's point is phenomenological. It doesn't mean he's not concerned about truth. Lacan's point is not phenomenological, it's psychological. And he is concerned with truth, the truth of human subjectivity. And his goal is always the same: happiness here on earth, happiness in the midst of fragmentation, happiness as a split subject. Before we go, I want to talk about love, and not just given who's here today with us, but just because it's important. One of the primary stakes here, after analysis, after the work has been done, is an opportunity to love like you never have. And people ask Lacan, what's that about? Self-compassion, I can understand that. But being with other people, tell me about that. Lacan, what is love? He answers, love is giving what you don't have. Some people would add, to somebody who doesn't want it. But Lacan himself says, love is giving what you don't have. What does that mean? Giving what you don't have. If you don't have something, you lack it. If you give it to somebody else, if you share lack with another, it's another way of saying that you allow them the same experience of lack. There's no math theme for love. It doesn't lend itself to fantasy or to any of the other little compositions that we have in the graph of desire. But it would have something to do with being cool enough with your own split subjectivity to allow the same in another. You might think of this as a kind of radical approach to acceptance or something along these lines. But remember Lacan's definition, giving what you don't have. This is love. And to have it reciprocated, I think sometimes that the ultimate horizon of this Lacanian stuff, as far as human beings are concerned, is a way of being with another person that allows lack not to be a problem, overcome at the level of the dream of Eden, overcome by a series of spa treatments where you and your partner hold hands as you get massaged. Nothing like that. It's a little grittier than that. It's about being fucked up together, if you will. And I would like to suggest that as we think about this as a clinical practice, I'd like to suggest that there is something satisfying, productive, not maladaptive, well adaptive about being able to be fucked up with somebody. You were not an addict and now you're not. You're always going to be an addict. That's who you are. That's what you are. And when you find somebody who's cool with that, who can hear that, you're in a different place. I think the goal of Lacanian analysis is to turn out subjects who know how to love in this way, who can see split subjectivity as a handsome condition, instead of the decline of humanity, the worst part of modernity and so forth. It's just the opposite. I don't know what kind of mood that results in, maybe a kind of humility. I think self-compassion comes very naturally to people who have undergone Lacanian psychoanalysis and reached the end. But uteromorphic dreams of wholeness and all the fundamental fantasies thereof, those are the things that usually you don't see when you meet people like this. It doesn't mean that they're happy with their misery or with you with yours. It just means that they have a kind of contentment, which is different from happiness, a kind of ease around discomfort. I think that's worth holding in mind as we take a little break here. I think it's worth holding in mind as we start moving deeper into the graph of desire. When we come back from lunch, or whatever this break is for you, I want to talk a little bit about how it is that language comes into our lives. And I want to show you at a really granular level, even at the risk of verging onto developmental psychology, how this shit happens, how it is that we wind up as split subjects, and how it is that others, primary caregivers in particular, play a part in this. What I'm trying to get at here is some way of showing us where we come from as linguistic beings, but also in the spirit of this essay, what I want to show is how we become these desirous fuck-ups, these people that are never satisfied, that are constantly miserable, that constantly have to buy the next thing. How did we become so vulnerable to capitalism? It has something to do with how we are introduced in the field of language. It has something to do with developmental psychology. And I think Lacan has a pretty good finger on this. I bet you'll be able to come up with some other people who also have good fingers on this. But for our purposes, when we come back, I want to talk about the introduction into language, how that works, how it produces the fantasy of wholeness. I want to talk about how it also marks the origin of desire. And with that, an opportunity for something else, something beyond desire. And if you follow up the right-hand side of the graph of desire, as we did at the start of this class, beyond desire is the drive. What we want to be able to do by the end of today is know a little bit more about how to keep the drive alive in the midst of desire. And we'll start getting this when we come back and start working developmentally on the origin of language and language use. So let's pause there. We'll see you back. What are we talking about here? 12:30, 2:30? Is 2:30 when we come back?
Sure.
All right, let's come back at 2:30. But I will also want you to know that I'm letting you out 8 minutes early. And that means you owe me. You owe me 8 minutes. So I reserve the right to mess with your schedule by 8 minutes in the opposite direction. You know that, right? This is a gift. This is the gift of shit. 8 minutes. 8 minutes is all you get, and I want it back. Like I said, you have to get your money's worth, right? This would be negligent of me to not give you your full time. Great, now it's become 7 minutes. So now it's gonna be 7 minutes. All right, y'all, for real, take a break. Thank you for this as well, because I know we didn't take a break this morning. I, of course, will not ask you to repay the gift of shit known as 7 minutes, but I will see you back here at, will somebody just confirm what our time is?
The lunch break is an hour and a half.
Okay, so what are we talking about? Hold on.
We're supposed to be back at 2 p.m. technically.
Okay, great. I'll see you back here at 2 p.m.